before your talk. So, welcome, good morning. Today is the last session, and may I greet you all, and thank you for especially for those loyal people who've been here since Thursday. This morning, it's my pleasure to introduce Nathan McGovern, who is the Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. And Nathan, today you are going to talk to us about the new Brahmanism without Greater Magadha. So I invite you to give your presentation.
Thank you, Dominic. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm so happy to be here today to share in this celebration of Johannes Bronkhorst's work and to contribute to the discussion about his Greater Magadha thesis. Johannes is one of those rare scholars who is both brilliant and prolific in his scholarship on the one hand and generous and accessible with his colleagues on the other. I, for one, have been profoundly influenced as a scholar in all senses of the term through my encounters with both his work and with him as a person. Yeah. I hope in this paper to do honor to Professor Bronkhorst and his scholarship through a critical engagement with it based on my own reading of the evidence that he considers for theorizing religion in ancient India. As those of us who work on ancient India know all too well, this evidence poses significant problems, particularly problems of chronology for the modern scholar, and thus all of us are in a sense groping in the dark as we attempt to understand the social realities behind the sources that come down to us. I'd like to begin by reviewing in detail what I consider Johannes's most brilliant contribution to the study of ancient Indian religions, the concept of the new Brahmanism, which he presented in Buddhism under the shadow of Brahmanism a few years after the publication of Greater Magadha. I realize this is a symposium about Greater Magadha, and I promise that I will get back to the Greater Magadha thesis shortly. But I want to begin with the new Brahmanism because its enormous utility for helping us to rethink the meaning of the sources for ancient Indian religion will shed light on what I have to say about the Greater Magadha thesis later on. In Buddhism under the shadow of Brahmanism, after a brief recapitulation of the Greater Magadha hypothesis, Bronkhorst sets the scene for a new thesis by describing the threat to Brahmanism posed by the rise of the imperial Nandas and Mauryas, culminating with Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE. He writes, the political developments that had been so favorable to Buddhism had been much less favorable to Brahmanism. Ashoka's inscriptions leave no doubt that, even though he showed respect for Brahmins, he had no place for them in his imperial administration. Traditional sacrificial Brahmanism had lost its economic basis with the installation of the Maurya Empire. Presumably, this had already begun under the Nandas. And if this was not yet bad enough, we've seen that Ashoka also forbade animal sacrifices. It seems fair to state that the unification of northern India under the Mauryas, and presumably already under the Nandas, was a disaster for traditional Brahmanism. All this might have signaled its end, but it did not. Brahmanism recovered, be it in a different form. It created the means to conquer itself a new place in the world, and it ended up being extraordinarily successful. A millennium after its most desperate period under the Mauryas, Brahmanism exerted an influence over large parts of South and Southeast Asia. Thus begins Bronkhorst's presentation of what he calls the new Brahmanism. The ideology cum strategy of this new Brahmanism can usefully be divided into 4 components. The first of these is what Bronkhorst calls the Brahmanical vision of society, that is the Varna system. As Bronkhorst astutely observes, the oldest Buddhist sources are aware of the Varna system, but they do not actually describe society in terms of it. Instead, these texts typically divide society into 3 broad groups: Brahmanas, Khatriyas, and Gahapatis. These 3 groups are not described as Varnas, nor are they entirely mutually exclusive. Brahmins can also be householders, as seen in the compound Brahmana Gahapati. When the early Buddhist sources do talk about the Varna system, they do so exclusively in the context of debates with Brahmins. They do so, in fact, to argue against it. But here's the key point, and this is possibly Bronkhorst's greatest ever contribution to scholarship, although that is debatable since there are so many things to choose from. The Buddhists didn't argue against the Varna system because they saw it as a real social evil to be overcome, a view that some 19th century scholars held, which was famously criticized by Oldenburg. No, they criticized the Varna system because it had nothing to do with the actual structure of society. It is difficult to overstate the importance of this insight. The second component of the new Brahmanism that Bronkhorst describes is the valorization of Sanskrit beyond the narrow confines of Vedic study, recitation, and commentary. In this, Bronkhorst is building upon the concept of the Sanskrit cosmopolis introduced by Sheldon Pollock, excuse me, but with a substantive critique of Pollock's framing. Pollock's thesis that Sanskrit became a cosmopolitan language by being adopted by kings for the first time in the early centuries of the Common Era for use in prashasti inscriptions and in literary kavya has become a sine qua non for understanding the history of Sanskrit and its place in classical India. Yet Pollock is at great pains to show that the adoption of Sanskrit as a literary language had nothing to do with quote unquote religion. I personally believe that this aspect of Pollock's argument could be successfully countered through an examination of his uncritical acceptance of the category religion alone. Nevertheless, I think that Bronkhorst quite convincingly demonstrates that Pollock is wrong on this point, that the rise of Sanskrit as a cosmopolitan language absolutely was tied to the spread of Brahmins and their ideology. This is important because insofar as the Sanskrit cosmopolis involved radical new uses of Sanskrit, it implies that Brahmins were doing radically new things with Sanskrit. The third component of the new Brahmanism is what Bronkhorst calls the Brahmanical colonization of the past. The central piece of evidence for this component that Bronkhorst presents is the Brahmanical reworking of the Arthashastra to make it the product of a supposedly Brahmanical administration in the Mauryan Empire. This involved not only revising the Arthashastra to reflect the Brahmanical vision of society, that is the Varna system, but also fabricating the story that the author was a Brahmanical minister of Chandragupta Maurya named Chanakya. I find this argument completely convincing, and I think it is worth adding that much of the Brahmanical literature that we associate with classical Hinduism is part of this project of writing the ideology of the new Brahmanism into the past. The Ramayana, as it comes down to us, takes a simple story of a human hero, what Brockington calls righteous Rama, and transforms it into a tale involving Vedic gods and the incarnation of one of them, Vishnu, as the hero. The Mahabharata takes what, as Witzel has argued, may have been a historical battle, the Battle of the 10 Kings, and transforms it into a cosmic battle involving the incarnations of various Vedic gods, a romanticized vision of Vedic sacrifice as the frame story, and an encyclopedic inventory of the religio-philosophical speculations of the time, organized within the framework of the Varna system. Finally, the Puranas extend this project of creative myth-making by framing discussions of human history within stories of the gods that ever reinscribe the Brahmanical vision of society. The fourth and final component of the new Brahmanism is what Bronkhorst calls the Brahmanization of borrowed features. The example that Bronkhorst gives for this component is the ashrama, a place of idyllic renunciatory Vedic practice that he argues was mostly propaganda used to fuel royal donations of what he argues were the real equivalent of Agrahara land grants. I'm less convinced by this argument than the others, in part because the Buddhist Jataka literature is replete with references to non-Buddhist ashramas, and because the Buddhist Vinaya treats the practitioners in these ashramas, which it calls jatilas, as real religious others who should be accorded certain privileges when ordaining in the Buddhist Sangha. Nevertheless, Bronkhorst is certainly correct in identifying the Brahmanization of borrowed features in general as a component of the new Brahmanism. In fact, the essence of this argument is not entirely new. Scholars have recognized for decades that Brahmanism adopted local customs and cults as it spread throughout India by Brahmanizing them. Srinivas's old Sanskritization hypothesis is based on the idea, and for a more recent close study of this process in action, one can look to Kunal Chakrabarti's religious process, a study of Puranas written in Bengal. Let me summarize what I find to be so profound and useful about Bronkhorst's concept of the new Brahmanism for studying ancient India. It shows us that Brahmanism is not some static entity filled with unchanging content that has acted throughout Indian history. It instead theorizes Brahmanism as a dynamic movement that has changed and reacted to events happening around it. It thus allows us scholars to see Brahmanism not as a meta-historical essence intervening in Indian history, but rather as an identity that emerges out of that history through continual articulation, contestation, and re-articulation. For that reason, in my own work, I have suggested calling the new Brahmanism instead Neo-Brahmanism. I suggested this change in nomenclature in part to make it slightly less cumbersome, but also because the neo prefix implies not only something that is new, but also something that is substantively different from the original, while depending on the original as a source of legitimation. But whatever we call this phenomenon that arose in the wake of the imperial Nandas and Mauryas, whether the new Brahmanism or neo-Brahmanism, its greatest utility lies in the fact that it gives us permission, nay, it demands that we call into question nearly every aspect of the Brahmanism, if any, that preceded its new or neo articulation. I beg your indulgence now to say a few words about a very different context than we are accustomed to addressing in Indology, since this other context, I believe, offers powerful parallels that will help us to understand the place of the new Brahmanism in the history of ancient India. The other context I am speaking of is the rise of Rabbinic Judaism in the wake of the success of Christianity, in particular as that rise has been theorized by Daniel Boyarin. Boyarin has, in a series of books, posited a radical new way of thinking about the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, rejecting the traditional parent-child model in favor of a model of two siblings that brought one another into being through the efforts of their elites to delineate clear boundaries between the two. This main thesis that Boyarin offers, while important, is less relevant to comparison to the situation in ancient India than are its implications for understanding the history of Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism, Boyarin argues, developed in particular ways to distinguish itself from Christianity, and this is the key point, in the process suppressed certain aspects of its own heritage. This insight arises out of abandoning the assumption that Christianity and Judaism always possess some intrinsic difference, and recognizing that the ability to distinguish between them was forged by elites on both sides over the course of centuries. I will focus on three particular points Boyarin makes to flesh out this model. The first is the issue of a divine Messiah. While many scholars have assumed that this was a distinguishing feature of Christianity, likely due to outside Greek influence, Boyarin convincingly argues that such a concept fit quite comfortably within the diversity of first century Judaism. It is based on a particular reading of the so-called Son of Man in the book of Daniel as a second divine figure, which in turn may harken back to the dualism between El and Yahweh in early Israelite religion. This issue was, of course, fiercely contested, but the point is that the controversy over the possibility of a divine Messiah already existed in Judaism and was not introduced by Christians from the outside. Rabbinic Judaism simply suppressed it because of its association with Christianity. The second relevant part of Boyarin's model is the innovative nature of first century Pharisaism that laid the foundation for Rabbinic Judaism. As Boyarin demonstrates, certain passages from the Gospels have been misinterpreted by Christians and even modern scholars as saying that Jesus rejected the Torah or strict adherence to the law. On the contrary, what he rejected was the innovations that the Pharisees introduced, what they called the, quote, tradition of the elders, an oral tradition dating back to the Babylonian exile that became the basis for the halakhic tradition of Rabbinic Judaism. Jesus, as well as early Christians who kept kosher, were thus in a certain sense conservative in following the basic precepts of the law, but not the oral traditions enjoined by Pharisees on their fellow Jews. The important takeaway is that Rabbinic Judaism was in certain ways quite innovative, and its innovations gave rise to an extensive literature, the Talmud. Finally, Boyarin argues that first century Judaism was far more Hellenistic than later Jewish tradition was wont to admit. He rejects the dichotomy between a pure Palestinian Judaism and an impure Hellenistic Judaism found outside of the homeland. The gospel writers, St. Paul, other writers who contributed to the New Testament, and a host of early church fathers all wrote in Greek. This did not set them apart from real Judaism, but was simply indicative of the hegemonic status of Greek as the lingua franca in the Eastern Roman Empire in the first century. Jews had centuries earlier translated their scriptures into Greek as the Septuagint, and non-Christian Jewish authors of the first century, namely Philo of Alexandria and Josephus, both wrote in Greek and engaged with Greek philosophy just as much as did the early Christian fathers. This is not to say that there was no reactionary resistance among Jews against Hellenization. Such resistance goes back to the Maccabees, but such resistance should not be allowed to obfuscate the fact that Judaism as a whole participated for centuries in Hellenistic culture and was profoundly influenced by it. Boyarin argues that Rabbinic Judaism suppressed this aspect of its own heritage in large part because of the association of Christianity with Hellenism by valorizing Hebrew and neglecting the contributions made by Judaism's most prominent Greek writing intellectuals, Philo and Josephus. To summarize, then, there are three major ways in which, according to Boyarin's model, Rabbinic Judaism innovated in the wake of Christianity's rise in order to distinguish itself from the latter. Two of these had to do with suppressing aspects of the Jewish tradition. It suppressed the concept of a divine Messiah as a Christian deviation from monotheism, even though that concept had a prominent place in pre-Christian Jewish thought. And it valorized Hebrew in an effort to suppress the memory of the prominent role Hellenism played in the history of Judaism. The third was an example of what I will call creative conservatism. The halakhic tradition and vast Talmudic literature were incredibly innovative and, in a quite literal sense, added to the Torah. But the rhetorical frame in which they were developed was a conservative one, intended to defend and explicate upon the Torah, as exemplified by the maxim that halakhic ordinances were intended to, quote, build a wall around the biblical commandment. I would argue that there are clear parallels to these characteristics of Rabbinic Judaism to be found in the New Brahmanism. Like Rabbinic Judaism, a key feature of the New Brahmanism was the innovative revalorization of an old scriptural language no longer in everyday use. Indeed, the New Brahmanism was so effective in this respect that until quite recently, with the work of Sheldon Pollock, it blinded scholars to the ubiquity of Prakrits in ancient Indian discourse prior to the Rudradaman inscription. Like Rabbinic Judaism, the New Brahmanism displayed creative conservatism through the production of a vast Smriti literature that went far beyond the narrow confines of the Vedic thought world, while always rhetorically orienting itself toward the Vedas. And finally, like Rabbinic Judaism, the New Brahmanism sought to suppress an aspect of its own tradition that became associated with a religious rival, or rather rivals, in this case, celibate renunciation, which it accomplished, albeit incompletely, through the Varna and Ashrama systems. This third parallel finally brings me to the point where I am in disagreement with Bronkhorst. So it is worth exploring in more detail. Bronkhorst is not entirely explicit on this issue, but according to my reading, the greater hypothesis is crucial to understanding why the early Buddhist texts treat the Varna system not as a sociological reality, but as an abstract theory of the Brahmins to be refuted in debate. That is, and this is where I am somewhat unclear and hope that Johannes can elucidate his argument for us, the Varna system was in some sense real in the Western Kuru homeland of the Brahmins, but it was not in Greater Magadha where Buddhism began. I have a different approach. I argue that the Varna system was in some sense new at this time, or at least was used in a significantly new way, not just in Greater Magadha, but in general. I elaborate this approach at length in chapter 5 of my book, The Snake and the Mongoose, so I will only provide a brief sketch here. The antiquity of the classical Varna system has, I argue, been grossly exaggerated. Vedic texts speak of social classes, and they refer to privileges of high birth over low birth in some sense, but it is only with the Dharma Sutras that we see a clear articulation of a theory of 4 social classes called Varnas, rigidly determined by birth. This may seem to be a subtle shift, but it is an important one, especially when read in the context of the concomitant articulation of the pre-classical ashrama system. As Olivel showed, the ashrama system in the Dharma Sutras was a set of 4 options for lifelong vocations. And this was only later changed by Manu into a system of 4 stages of life. As I demonstrate, however, all 4 Dharma Sutras show a clear preference for the householder ashrama over the other 3, which involves celibate renunciation. I therefore argue that the Varna system and ashrama system, as first articulated in the Dharma Sutras, worked in tandem to delegitimize celibate renunciation and establish a basis for Brahmanhood that was not tied to celibate renunciation, but rather to birth. Taken together with the fact that the theory of mixed castes cannot plausibly be read as making sense as a literal sociological model, this shows that the Varna system was not a straightforward description of society anywhere in India, but rather an ideological tool serving a particular agenda. What then was this agenda? Just as the rabbis were at pains to distinguish themselves from Christians by suppressing interpretations of Daniel that involved a divine Messiah, so were the Dharma Sutra authors at pains to suppress aspects of the Vedic tradition that indicated that Brahmahood could be attained through some sort of austerity. As I show in my book, early Buddhists and Jains claimed to be Brahmins, or rather claimed that those who were truly liberated in their respective systems were Brahmins. Modern scholars have typically argued that such passages are just polemics, co-opting the title of a more prestigious religious rival, but I argue that they make perfect sense in the context of the Vedic heritage if taken at face value. Early Buddhists and Jains referred to their practice of celibate renunciation as Brahmacharya, a Vedic term, and there are indeed passages of the Vedas that can be plausibly read as saying that Brahmacharya is what makes someone a Brahmin. Jesus as a divine Messiah was not a perversion of the Jewish tradition introduced by Hellenistic Christians. It was a plausible interpretation of Daniel entertained by some Jews long before Christianity that the rabbis then suppressed because of its association with Christianity. In the same way, celibate renunciation was not an extra Vedic practice introduced by Shramanas from somewhere else. It was a plausible interpretation of the Vedas that the proponents of the new Brahmanism attempted to suppress through the systems of Varna and Ashrama. This finally brings me to my thesis, and I should take a drink of water, excuse me. I'm just very excited, sorry. And I thank you for your indulgence in waiting so long to get here. The Greater Magadha hypothesis is not simply wrong, it is completely unnecessary to explain what Bronkhorst thinks he needs it to explain in the broader context of his scholarship. I know that I'm not alone among scholars in being frustrated by a certain circularity in the Greater Magadha argument. Bronkhorst describes the culture of Greater Magadha in the following way: fundamentally separate from the Vedic culture of the Kurus to the west, characterized by belief in rebirth and karmic retribution, and devoted to the building of round sepulchral mounds. He then uses this fundamental dichotomy between a Vedic West and non-Vedic East to explain changes that took place in Indian religion. In particular, the rise of the Shramana traditions around the time of the rise of imperial states out of Magadha. Finally, if any source refers to the fundamental spiritual ideology, that's Bronkhorst's term, that he associates with Greater Magadha, he takes that as evidence of influence from Greater Magadha. This applies even to Brahmanical sources, and even to Brahmanical sources as old as the early Upanishads. In recognition of the problem posed by this last point, Bronkhorst devotes about a third of his book to questioning the chronology of the entire Vedic literature, with the apparent but never fully articulated purpose of insinuating that those passages in the Vedic literature that fit uncomfortably with his thesis are late enough to be due to the influence of Greater Magadha. To be clear, I have no problem with the concept of a separate culture for Greater Magadha in a weak sense. The region Bronkhorst calls Greater Magadha and the Kuru homeland are separated by a certain physical distance. And so of course they must, in the middle of the first millennium BCE, have been characterized by certain cultural differences, just as they are today. These differences may have even included differences in material culture, such as the custom of building round burial mounds. As Bronkhorst is keen to point out, certain Brahmanical authors look to the Eastern culture of Greater Magadha with some disdain. But we should know from experience that the cultural differences necessary to produce such disdain are slight. At the risk of making myself sound as bigoted as Patanjali, I would point out that I personally hold the American South in a bit of cultural disdain. But in my defense, I'm not the only American who does. But that is in spite of the fact that the American South is fully integrated into the economic, social, and political life of the rest of the country. And the fact that I personally lived for 16 years, almost my entire childhood, in the American South. This is not simply a result of mass media either. For as long as there have been English-speaking settlers in the territory that is now in the United States, North and South have always been closely integrated politically, socially, culturally, and economically. There is no reason to believe that the same was not true for Northern India in the period we are considering. Indeed, we know for a fact that Patanjali himself, who excluded the East from Aryavarta, lived after a period of centuries in which Northern India hadn't been not just culturally, but politically integrated by the Nanda and Maurya dynasties. It is not radical difference, but rather familiarity that breeds contempt. The key point of Bronkhorst's Greater Magadha hypothesis is not that there were some cultural differences between the western and eastern reaches of the Gangetic Plain. That is inevitable, nor that Westerners might look upon Easterners with disdain. That is human nature. The operative principle of the Greater Magadha hypothesis is that the cultural differences were so great as to define two entirely different worldviews. On the one hand, a worldview of gods, priests, and sacrifice. On the other, a worldview of karma, rebirth, and renunciation. But this model is implausible on three counts. First, it fails to take into account the degree to which the Vedic culture was spread across northern India. Second, it fails to take into account the degree to which the worldview Bronkhorst describes the Greater Magadha can be traced to Vedic antecedents. And third, it posits a fundamentally implausible and frankly somewhat orientalizing dichotomy between the religious cultures of the two regions. I've already touched on the first of these 3 points in noting that Patanjali excluded Greater Magadha from Aryavarta, even after a long period of political integration between East and West. There's every reason to believe that that period of political integration was preceded by an even longer period of cultural integration. An illustrative parallel is the Warring States period in China. I'm surprised there haven't been more people who have made this comparison. In spite of the lack of political integration, there was a shared cultural sphere across the different Chinese polities, although this did not prevent disdain between them, with Song being the butt of jokes, much as Magadha was in India. These polities ultimately became politically united when the Qin emperor conquered all of the warring states in 221 BCE. Indian sources describe a very similar situation for North India in the middle of the first millennium BCE, with a series of Janapadas spread across the region, roughly west to east, that were ultimately united by Magadha under the Nandas and Mauryas. We know that the peoples of this region all spoke similar dialects of Middle Indo-Aryan, and we know that Brahmins and their Shakas were spread across this region as well. Even the earliest Buddhist and Jain texts refer to the Vedas and Vedic sacrifice. Although the origins of Vedic culture might have been to the West, Greater Magadha at the time of the first Shramana movements was hardly unfamiliar with it. This brings me to my second point, which is that the fundamental spiritual ideology Bronkhorst attributes to Greater Magadha is easily traced back to Vedic antecedents. And I'm so glad that so many other participants have already spoken about this today. I wrote this several weeks ago, so I mentioned some previous scholars, but I also want to highlight the contributions that have been made, especially by Lauren and by Alex and by Joanna in previous days. So, but what I've written here is, in fact, these antecedents have been so thoroughly traced by modern scholars that it is difficult to understand why there is such a strongly felt need for an extra Vedic source to explain the worldview of karma and rebirth. Indeed, the epistemological machine of bandhus, which has been well documented as characterizing the Brahmana literature, was ideally suited to create precisely the culture of speculative inquiry that could lead to the worldview of karma and rebirth, along with the rest of Indian philosophical thought. And I can't estimate or emphasize enough how important it is, I think, to take that culture, that intellectual culture, and that discourse seriously. And I particularly wanted to highlight the importance of Joanna's work that she's been doing for so many years in taking that seriously. As Hikari Yasuke has shown, the concept of rebirth has its origins in speculative comparisons between the funeral pyre and sacrificial fire. Herman Tull has shown that speculations in the Brahmanas led to the idea that one of the purposes of the Vedic yajna is for the yajamana to build an immortal self, or Atman, for his life in the other world. Hans-Peter Schmidt has shown that anxieties over reversal of fortunes in the next life and over the finitude of the rewards of sacrifice led to the principle of ahimsa, nonviolence, and of punarmrityu, or second death. Already in the Brahmanas, therefore, we see speculations about an immortal self, reversal of fortunes after death, a life after death, and even the possibility of dying again from that life after death. As Ganesh Umakantite has convincingly argued, the Upanishads do not represent a fundamental break from the Brahmanas. They simply continue the speculations started by the Brahmanas and earlier literature, but often extending them to greater cosmic proportions. It is thus not at all surprising that certain Upanishadic passages would point, if tentatively, to a worldview of continual rebirth according to karmic retribution, and do so in terms heavily laden with metaphors from the Vedic sacrifice. This is not a case of Brahmins dressing up a foreign concept in Vedic garb. If that were the case, we would expect to see a true cycle of rebirth according to karma explained using Vedic concepts. Instead, we see a variety of theories and speculations, none of which quite match up with the classical theory of samsara. This, by the way, explains the comment I made to Alex's paper yesterday, because I do think that Bronkhorst sort of has a point there, but takes it in the wrong direction. Moreover, Bronkhorst has no explanation for the fact that the fundamental spiritual ideology he attributes to Greater Magadha is expressed in terms, particularly Atman and Karma, that Vedic authors had been speculating about for centuries. It strains credulity to argue that Greater Magadha had a completely independent worldview of rebirth and karmic retribution that was expressed in terms that Western Brahmins just coincidentally had been speculating about for centuries, moving also in the direction of rebirth and ethical retribution. Finally, the Greater Magadha hypothesis, quite aside from the way in which it reads the evidence available to us, posits a dichotomy between the religious cultures of East and West that I would characterize as in principle simply implausible. In the West, we have a this-worldly culture of priestly sacrifice. I guess in your view, this is the West, sorry. In the West, we have a this-worldly culture of priestly sacrifice to the gods. In the East, we have a culture of renunciation to escape from a cycle of rebirth. I find it baffling to even attempt to draw out the implications of this dichotomy for understanding the pre-contact cultures of the West and East. Are we to assume that those in the West were only concerned with this worldly sacrifice to the gods and not with issues of renunciation or the afterlife? We have the Vedas at our disposal, so we know that this is not true, and not to beat a dead horse, that there are continuities between the Vedas and later views on renunciation, rebirth, and karma. On the other hand, are we to assume that those in the East were only concerned with renunciation to escape the cycle of rebirth and not with the sort of this worldly concerns addressed by sacrifice to the gods? The entire dichotomy appears to be predicated on an exotification of the culture of Greater Magadha that parallels the Orientalist exotification of the East. Ultimately, however, the Greater Magadha hypothesis is simply not necessary. We can explain the changes that took place in ancient Indian religion, that is, the rise of the Shramana traditions, on an orthogenetic basis without recourse to a completely hypothetical extra-Vedic source, whether explained by geographic difference or otherwise. But doing so requires recognizing that identities are not meta-historical. They do not intervene in historical events, but rather emerge out of historical events, dynamically and through contestation over those very identities themselves. The new Brahmanism that Bronkhorst so aptly describes is not the old Brahmanism reacting to something foreign to itself. It is rather a movement within Brahmanism that arose in reaction, and I mean this in the fully political sense of the term, to the most avant-garde strands within Brahmanism itself. The model that I have in mind is this. In and around the 5th century BCE in North India, there were a variety of groups of practical intellectuals, roughly akin to the philosophers of ancient Greece, but calling themselves Brahmins. These groups would have been organized around personal teacher-student relationships, just as with the philosophers in Greece. All would have been familiar with the thought world of the Vedas because the Vedic shakhas had spread throughout the region at this point, and indeed this spread had, practically speaking, created Brahmins as an intellectual class to begin with. Unsurprisingly, what precisely constituted Brahmanhood, or put differently, what criteria made one eligible for initiation in a lineage, would have varied from group to group, and indeed would have served as a focal point of contestation among them. We know of two broad types of qualification, both of which are referred to in Vedic texts and which originally need not have been mutually exclusive. The first is Brahmacharya, a period of initiation during which one practices celibacy and undergoes other sorts of renunciation and training. The second is high birth. To be clear, however, a criterion of high birth need not necessarily have taken the form that it did in the classical Varna system. In the famous story in the Chandogya Upanishad of Satyakama Jabala going to enter Brahmacharya under Haridrumata Gautama, the latter simply asks him what his Gotra is. This might seem in retrospect to indicate a requirement of birth within a closed Brahmin class, but as John Prof showed long ago, Gotras were originally possessed by all of high birth and only later associated specifically with Brahmins. For our purposes, however, the most important difference between the various groups of Brahmins in this period was their orientation toward the Vedas and the Vedic tradition. I cannot emphasize enough that all would have been familiar with the Vedas and their thought world. In fact, we know that they were because even the earliest Buddhist and Jain texts talk about Vedic gods and Vedic sacrifice. But that does not mean that all Brahmins would have engaged with the Vedas in the same way. The Vedic tradition was not some static entity that one was either a part of or not a part of. It was a dynamic, living, contested, and evolving culture. As with any living culture, there would have been a spectrum of positions within the thought world of that culture. I find it useful to think in terms of three basic orientations in this spectrum: the avant-garde, the conservatives, and the reactionaries. I will begin with the avant-garde because it is the easiest to define. These were the most radical Shramanas, those who gave rise to the Buddhists and the Jains. As with any avant-garde, they took the most radical ideas emerging from their intellectual milieu and ran with them. In the context of 5th century BCE North India, this took the form of systematizing the tentative moves toward theories of transmigration found in late Vedic thought, as well as theories for how to escape from that cycle. As with any avant-garde, they were not interested in constant reference back to their intellectual forebears, nor in the maintenance of tradition for tradition's sake. We should not allow this to fool us, however, into thinking that they were outsiders or were not indebted to the Vedic heritage that came before them. Picasso and Jackson Pollock are firmly within the tradition of Western art, even if their indebtedness to that heritage is less immediately obvious than that of everyday artists who sell still lifes and landscapes at art fairs. Once we recognize the avant-garde as a legitimate part of the tradition, it is easy to identify the reactionaries. Reactionaries look with horror upon the changes represented by the avant-garde and react so as to, in their minds, preserve tradition, but in ways that are not only just as innovative as the avant-garde, but also often unwittingly incorporate the avant-garde's ideas. In this context, the reactionaries were the proponents of the new Brahmanism, represented particularly by the Dharma Sutras that they authored. They were committed to the detailed study of the Vedas and performance of Vedic rituals. And they perceived the renunciants' lack of concern for these things as such a threat that they sought to redefine Brahmanhood as solely based on birth, as well as allowing for and even coming to the point of requiring that one live as a householder and not a renunciant. Excuse me. Ultimately, reactionaries are good at defining identities, but bad at stopping the social changes that motivated their reaction in the first place. The proponents of the new Brahmanism were very successful in arrogating the identity Brahmin to themselves, but they had absolutely no success in stopping the popularity of celibate renunciation or the worldview of karma, rebirth, and liberation. Indeed, Manu's change of the ashrama system from 4 vocations, with householder the best, into 4 stages of life signaled an accommodation of renunciation within certain parameters, and even these would prove mostly theoretical. Most later Brahmanical literature from the Mahabharata on would simply take the tension between this worldly and renunciatory orientations, as well as the whole worldview of samsara, for granted. This brings us to the conservatives, which are the most difficult to define. This is because by definition, conservatives do not make a lot of noise and thus do not leave much evidence in the historical record. To be clear, by conservative, I do not mean what most people mean by conservative, especially in the United States. Most people who call themselves conservative are actually reactionaries. They are horrified by changes in society that they really have no power to stop. And in an effort to stop them, they engage in reaction, a highly creative process that mirrors the changes it abhors in an effort that supposedly defends tradition, but in reality fundamentally transforms it. By conservatives, I mean those who simply go with the flow of social change. They are not a part of the avant-garde, so they do not reject traditional ideas or practices as irrelevant, but they also keep current with the latest trends without reacting against them. We don't really know about this group in ancient India from any direct sources because, again, conservatives don't make a lot of noise. But we do know about them from others. They are those whom Buddhist texts refer to with the slang term jatila, referring to their matted hair, and Brahmanical texts, the Dharma Sutras and others, refer to as vanaprasthas, or forest dwellers. These were people who clearly saw a moderate degree of renunciation, with or without celibacy, as fully compatible with study of the Vedic texts and performance of Vedic rituals. They were thus neither a part of the avant-garde nor reacting against it. To conclude then, the Greater Magadha hypothesis, aside from being based on a problematic reading of the evidence, is simply not necessary to explain the rise of the new Brahmanism. Although there were certainly certain cultural differences between what Bronkhorst calls Greater Magadha and the area further to the west, there is every indication that these two areas participated in a shared linguistic, cultural, economic, and beginning with the Nandas, political world. More importantly, the worldview that Bronkhorst attributes to Greater Magadha, the worldview of a cycle of rebirth and liberation from that cycle, can, and to my mind should, in the absence of compelling alternative evidence, be traced back to the Vedas. The search for the bandhus that began in the Brahmanas created an intellectual culture of speculation that led to ideas about life after death, the creation of an immortal self for that life, the possibility of retribution for one's violence toward animals in that life, a second death from the afterlife, and ultimately in the Upanishads, rebirth and karmic retribution. The most radical Shramana movements, which ultimately gave birth to Buddhism and Jainism, streamlined the concept of rebirth into a cycle and embraced practices of renunciation under the rubric of Brahmacharya to seek liberation from that cycle. That these movements were associated with the Greater Magadha region is likely due to the shift in economic and political power in North India toward the east. The issue was not that Greater Magadha had its own separate culture, even though it did in some sense, but that it was the cosmopolitan center where innovation was taking place. The situation is much the same in the United States today, with cultural innovation emanating from the West Coast and the Northeast corridor between DC and Boston. These two areas are leaders that drive change in American culture and are not at all separate from American culture as much as American reactionaries want to paint them as such. My argument is that reactionaries in late first millennium BCE India did the same thing that reactionaries today in the United States and always throughout history have done. They defended what they saw as a tradition under threat by mirroring the very movement they felt threatened by, effectively rewriting their own tradition in the process. In his book, Greater Magadha, Bronkhorst has fallen for the very tricks of the new Brahmanism that identifies in Buddhism under the shadow of Brahmanism. In the latter, which I consider to be his greatest work, he shows clearly that Brahmanism reinvented itself and then retrojected its new image into the past. This means that we as historians must be careful in assessing the historical evidence because so much effort has been made to rewrite history in the time intervening. This phenomenon is actually universal and thus affects all historians, no matter what culture or period in history they study. But as Bronkhorst has shown, the new Brahmanism was particularly intensive in a project of rewriting its own and India's history. And this forces us as historians to rethink much of what we thought we knew about Indian history prior to the new Brahmanism. All of us, including Bronkhorst himself, would do well to heed this advice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Wow, how stimulating. What a lot of interesting parallels you draw, which really, I think, help to think. So thank you very much. I've got a number of questions and observations, but let me open it to the floor.
I think Philip was first, and then Joanna.
Well, I didn't see hands. John, would you like to go first?
John
I saw you first.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't want to push ahead of the line to the front of the line. It was a very interesting talk. Thanks. But if I can just take a step back, because I'm not at all a religious historian in any way, shape, or form. I'm from an entirely different subject. Can we? I mean, don't we need to look at the Greater Magadha theory not as one just about religion, but whether or not we can assume that the eastern part of northern India was different from the western part? When I look at the linguistic evidence, I cannot deny it. There is a difference. It's as clear as day. We can argue about what caused it, but there is the fact is that the languages of the East, the Indo-Aryan languages of the East, were markedly different from those in the West. Now, the default interpretation has to be, well, that's because other peoples assumed the Indo-Aryan languages, and they must have been at least half the population, if not a good-sized majority. I mean, it's a default interpretation. You can override it, but every time you want to override the default, you have to give evidence for doing so, which is, I mean, I'm sure it's in your discipline no different from in mine. Now, my question would be, going back to your example with Christianity and Judaism, would Judaism ever have reacted to this Masonic, whatever you want to call it, belief, if Christianity had not really forced it to. And so I would say the same thing for India. I mean, I'm going too far here. This is not my area, but isn't it possible to say we have a difference in the East, and it must have been due to the indigenous population that was there? Probably many, many, many different ethnic groups speaking different languages from different families. Could it not be that those who went to the East became acculturated to a certain extent, even though they were in charge in a certain sense, that they also took in part of that culture, which may have been present in the West, but they, as you to use the expression you used, they took it and ran with it, and those in the West maybe had to react. So I don't want to get into this discussion of whether or not Johannes was right about the religious part. I cannot say anything about that, but we do have a clear difference linguistically in the East, which demands an explanation. And I also keep wondering, I know you're all Indologists, and Indologists work with old texts, the older the better. But does anyone work with the new religions? I mean, I know many ethnologists and anthropologists looking at so-called tribal religions, and they find a number of commonalities. And so far, I've missed that here entirely, looking at what we know about what may have been there, to this extent that it's reconstructible, which is a whole different matter, of course, I realize that. But has anyone been taking a look at those concepts that we think we can project back into the past and comparing them with the novelties that arose in the East? A very naive question, but yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that question.
Respond?
Yeah. That was a question. Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I have to be honest. Like, I was questioning myself too, like during your presentation, and I'm not a linguist myself, and also you're dealing with later languages, and I think that this question was asked of you later. But like, for example, the issue of ergativity, like, I mean, there's no ergativity East or West in Middle Indo-Aryan, as far as I know. Is there? Maybe I don't understand what ergativity.
Well, you wouldn't call it ergativity, you'd call it the PPP construction. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
With the transitive subject and the instrumental.
I don't know enough about this but
sure, yeah.
So I just, looking at later linguistic evidence, I mean, so much later, like 2,000 years, I mean, it just raises questions for me of, is this due to deep differences in the Indo-Aryan substrate, or more recent differences, say with the incursion of Persian, which obviously played a very, very important role in the development of the modern Indo-Aryan dialects. I don't know. It just raised a question for me. It's like, I know there are differences in Middle Indo-Aryan, East and West too. I'm just not sure that. So to get to your question, it is, well, let me back up. I'm a religious studies scholar, and precisely because I'm a religious studies scholar, I don't like the word religion, especially when we're talking about the ancient world, because it's a very modern Western concept at all. However, having said that, I think naively we can say that, yes, it is a question of religion. In other words, that this is the argument I was making in the paper, which is that obviously there would be, this is true anywhere. You take any 2 points on a map, right? They're going to have differences culturally, right? Like, duh, like that's going to be there. The real part of the greater Magadha thesis is the issue of the worldview of samsara, right? Karma, rebirth, and liberation, right? And so I do think that it is specifically a question of that, and so the problem I have with that is that I don't see, of course there would be cultural differences between East and West. I just don't see the need, especially in the absence of other evidence, to there's no need to have that explanation to explain where it came from, especially considering like how much you see that in the Vedic evidence. And it's possible that even the earliest Upanishads are later than Buddhism. It's possible, but I think the difficulty that you enter with the argument that the Bronkhorst is trying to make is like, how far back are we going to push it, right? I think that scholars like Joanna, for example, and others have shown that like these speculations go really far back in the Vedic tradition. Obviously, they do not take the form that they do in Buddhism, but it's like there is a continuity there. It doesn't just like appear out of nowhere if you look at the Vedic evidence, and that's evidence that we do have. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
It does, thanks.
Was it Philip, maybe?
Philip, I
Thank
think,
you.
was next.
Yes, thank you very much, Nathan. I must say that I enjoyed your talk a lot. Like Dominic said, very stimulating, a lot of provocative thesis that you voice in a very eloquent way. And I must say, I admire this very much, and I enjoyed it very much. Two things that I wanted to remark. The first is that you said that in the Mahabharata, the concept of rebirth and samsara is simply taken for granted. And I think that's not true. I think it's debatable.
Okay, can I respond to that real quick? As I was rereading that last night, I realized like, that's maybe a bit of an overstatement. Taken for granted makes it sound like it's just, it's everywhere. It's there. Let me put it like
yes,
for example, in the
there. Yes, okay.
But yeah, every single part of the Mahabharata taken for granted. You're right. That is a bit of an overstatement.
Yes, it is there because one could argue along with Johannes' thesis that the Mahabharata is a process of integration of different worldviews. So the Mahabharata may confirm Johannes' thesis or not. So, but the other remark that I wanted to make is that you said, you see the theory of samsara, karma, and rebirth as a logical continuation of Vedic thought. I wonder, however, if we look at the Samanyapala Sutta that we had talked about yesterday already, where Ajatashattu asks, whom of the Brahmanas or Shamanas shall we worship? And I think the idea is to address somebody who can tell him something about karma, rebirth, samsara, how to leave it. So this is the intellectual and religious horizon that plays out in this sutta. And none of these heretics that he mentions, and that are mentioned in the Samanyapala Sutta, is a Vedic Brahmana who has anything to say about how to leave samsara. On the other hand, or those that are mentioned, they are, as far as they are identifiable, these are Jainas, we have the Ajivikas mentioned there, and they all share this horizon. So, and I think that this could be taken as an indication that at that time, Brahmanism simply did not play a role among those who were dealing with samsara, karma, and rebirth. What would you?
Okay. So see, I do have a very specific response to that. It's in my book. I have a whole chapter about the issue of Shramanas and Brahmanas and the way that phrase is used, both in Buddhist suttas like the one that you quoted, and also in the edicts of Ashoka. I'm really interested in identity, and so that's why the approach I take in the talk that I just gave and also in the book is really focused on thinking. It's a methodological argument, like how are we going to theorize identity? A lot of this data has been known for well over a century, in the international, in international scholarly circles, but it's a matter of how we interpret it. So I think actually that what you quoted supports my thesis quite well, which is that it's weird to from the standard viewpoint to see a discussion of quote Shramanas and Brahmanas, or Shramanas and Brahmanas, that then doesn't seem to include Brahmins. But that's only a problem if you assume that Brahmins are what the new Brahmanism says that they are. My argument is that this phrase Shramanas and Brahmanas was not a mutually exclusive sort of dualism at all.
I know.
Okay. Yeah. So for that reason, like within that context, who are you going to quote? You're going to quote people who have interesting things to say about the question, which are going to be Shramanas, not people who are householders accumulating wealth and not striving for liberation. Does that make sense? I think that answered your question, but I don't know if I stated it clearly.
Partly. I mean, I'm of course, I read your book and I know your thesis, but that was not actually the direction of my question.
Okay.
It was with regard to contents of the teachings that are reported from the heretics in the Samanyapala Sutta, and none of those that are mentioned there would have been a Brahmin who had developed a hypothesis of samsara on the background of.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. Yeah. No. That's a good point. Like proto-Sankyans or something like that, right? Something along those lines. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. Yeah, I think that I think the reason for that would be, I see the point that you're making. I'd have to look at the text more closely, and it would be great actually if we could do it together, because I think that could be really interesting. But my initial thought, like not look at the text deeply right in front of me, is that what you're going to see, I think what that reflects is in a snapshot of time, like who did the authors of that sutta see as their possible intellectual rivals, and it does put an emphasis on, I think, themselves, and then like Ajivaka Jains. That's true. I do think there are some longer discussions, however, that do veer a little bit more in the territory of what we might consider more Mahabharatish and Puranic-ish Brahmins. I have a vague recollection, I think in the Samanyapala Sutta, of something about creation. I mean, I think there are contexts in which that is alluded to. But I do know what you're referring to, that there's a very specific set, and they do seem to lead towards like Jains and Ajivakas as rivals. So, I mean, I would have to look in more detail to, I feel confident, but I would have to look in more detail to have a more specific response to your question. I'll do that. Remind me. Email me, please.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
I know I mustn't hog this, but I think it's worth remembering in this particular context about that, about Gombrich's argument that a lot of early Buddhist allusions seen in the Pali literature, a lot of Buddhist allusions to Brahmanical points of view are satirical. And I think that plays into some of this. We should take that into account when thinking about it. Johanna, yes.
Yes. Oh, thank you for your talk very much. And yes, it was very inspiring. And I like also your broad perspective when you take into account some human, the way how humans behave, and which of course changes during times, but something sometimes can be seen at least as similar. Well, I would like to just note 2 points. One is that you were talking about Brahmanic composers, that it was a live community, a living community with. And you can find we find many places in the Shatapadha Brahmana and other Brahmanas about people who perform, for example, ritual in another way. And then it is, they say, Tathana Kuryat, because when you do like this, the meaning is like this, so you should do in the way we propose. And it is almost everywhere, and sometimes, yes. So this is one thing. And the second thing is the problem of the word Shramana, because as far as I know, it doesn't appear in the Brahmanas, at least in the Brahmanas I know the best Shatapadha Brahmana, and for sure in the Atharva Veda, Shaunakya, and in the Rig Veda, but the verb sham appears in the Rig Veda, and it is used to denote the effort which you have to perform when you want to kindle fires. So and then you become hot. And then in the Shatapadha Brahmana and in other Brahmanas, the only Shramana is Prajapati. So this word, so Shramyat Satapotapyata, is used to to express a kind, well, the way how they imagined God's, their, let's put me like this, God's activity, and they conceived it in terms of a huge effort, which led to feel hot, and then something happened to the agent, which transformed the agent in a different, totally. So Prajapati, for example, or he dies. So it was something, and because I'm cognitive linguist, and I'm also in favor of this rather widespread now, wide accepted theory that our cognition is embodied and that we cannot escape from our even bodily experience, but also cultural, and that it somehow frames our thinking. So my intuition is that they were referring to kind of activities they performed themselves in order to get a mental transformation, yes. And because we know from the Rig Veda that Soma, the first effect of Soma was being hot, and then sweating, and it is said in the Rig Veda, even in some places explicitly, but mostly implicitly in metaphors. So it is possible they lost Soma, so during Brahmanas, because they changed the place of living. So, but they recited the texts in which this idea was all the time repeated and repeated. Yes, so they, my hypothesis is that they tried to somehow to get this incredible heat, and the simplest way was, which transforming heat, and the simplest way was to perform an activity that called shram, with the verb shram. So I like your idea about reactionists who were shramanas, because I think that it could be like this, that the late Vedic society somehow split into those two kind of practitioners. One who were followers of Prajapati's method, and the other one were like Yajnavalkya, who mastered breathing without external material anchors. So this is just my thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was another word that I forgot to mention, which is that
keep your remarks really, really short, Nathan.
Yeah, shramming was something found in the Vedic tradition too. Shramming was not new. Yeah, if I can invent an English word, shramming.
Shramming, yes.
Thank you very much. Johannes, did you want to respond?
You're muted, Johannes. Still muted.
Sorry.
There we go.
There we go. Thank you very much for this presentation, which is very detailed and raises many issues and many points. And of course, it's totally impossible to deal with all of them. I would like to make two remarks, and I think the second is more important, but I do wish to start with the first one. And I've noticed that some of the speakers, they either have completely skipped a part of Greater Magadha about chronology, or they have not taken it seriously. In the opening lecture, I said, I've emphasized, and I think that's the case, there is no fallback position. If someone has an other view, let him come up with arguments. So if someone is of the opinion that the early Upanishads have to be earlier than Buddhism and Jainism, I'm open to listen to arguments. I haven't yet heard any, except one. And you raised it today, and a few other speakers raised it as well. And that's to discuss that. Let me recall that at some point I say these late Vedic texts present the doctrine of rebirth and karmic retribution dressed up in a Vedic garb. And I think quite a number of among you have felt uncomfortable with that. Well, we have heard in two other lectures how what is supposed to be the development on Vedic thought that culminates in this particular doctrine of rebirth and retribution. The fact is that, as I hear it, this is a description of the clothes that into which, in the end, this new doctrine is put. Most of these developments have absolutely nothing to do with rebirth and karmic retribution. That really comes, I still think, for the first time in some Upanishadic passages, and even almost in one passage, I can't cite them all by heart, almost as an afterthought. There is all kinds of things happening of a very Vedic nature, and then good acts lead to good rebirth, bad acts lead to bad rebirths. Now, of course, if you want to see it that way, then you also have to accept that people who later on adopted this doctrine, like the ancestors of Buddhism and Jainism, they had to do a lot of undressing. These texts don't say very clearly and explicitly anything resembling what is the foundation of Buddhism and Jainism at all. They have a complicated Vedic story with all kinds of things, and the details are endless, as we have heard at this occasion. So you have to assume that somehow there were people who thought, yes, this is wonderful, and we take everything away, and we take this little bit that was there added in a footnote, and that we make central. It is conceivable, but to me, rather not particularly convincing. I turn to my second point. I wonder to what extent, what may be part of your central thesis, to what extent it is merely terminological. Perhaps there were people in this remote past about which we have very little direct access and knowledge, call themselves Brahmins. But before we know what happened, they have already split up, according to your theory, into three groups: the avant-garde on the one hand and one other, and then the Vanaprastha, the other kind of ascetics, they fit into another group. And here you started criticizing a cultural divide, but before we know what happens, you have the same cultural divide, only have given a different background story. A background story which, by its nature, has to be speculative because we don't have direct information about that. So in that sense, I think your theory is not all that different from what I present in Greater Magadha. The main difference, of course, is, or a major difference is the regional division. And here, as I said in the beginning, I look very much for additional evidence. To me, it seems fairly reasonable for a variety of reasons, and not least that Buddhism and Jainism arose in that part of the subcontinent and not anywhere else. And but I like to emphasize that to some extent you end up at the same place as where I was in my Greater Magadha. Would you agree with that?
Dominic, do we have time? I mean,
well,
it's gonna take a
Andrea,
while.
we will give Andrea time at the end, the other end of his time slot. So yes, I think this is really important. I don't want to miss it.
Okay, sure. So the first point, yeah, how to respond. So I think, and if I can be so bold as to speak for others who I think who have you feel have not taken your chronological argument seriously, I think that for all of us, we just find, well, actually, I'll speak for myself in this respect. Clearly, there has in the past several decades been a very felt need to rethink certain aspects of the chronology of ancient Indian texts in general, not just Vedic, right? And I think a lot of interesting insights have come out of that. I guess what I'm saying is that the arguments that you make about the Vedas either go too far or else, because you're not always clear, and I get this, like it's difficult to say. That's why I use the word insinuation. There's a certain insinuation, I think, in your argument, that we can explain away certain problematic passages by saying, well, these are post-Buddhist or whatever. My response to that is, and I said this earlier in response to someone, I think, I don't think there is enough continuity in Vedic thought that's been traced in, I think, very clear ways, including by people in this room, this virtual room, that you can't push the chronology back enough. Like you can't find enough Vedic texts that are post-Buddhist to get before a point within that intellectual continuity. And because it's like, okay, so let's say that the Upanishadic passages are post-Buddhist. Well, what about the Brahmanical passages? Well, if not that, well, then what about the Rig Veda? It's like there's this continuity there, and
none of them express the doctrine and rebirth and karmic retribution.
I've already talked about this. I really think we need to take the discourse seriously, and this is really a methodological issue. I do think that in thinking about chronology, and this is why I'm not particularly convinced that the earliest Upanishads are post-Buddhist. I do think that we have to think about the way in which different texts appear to be responding to each other. And I think that the fact that even the Upanishadic passages don't really show the classical theory of karma and rebirth is an indication, and moreover, they're swimming in lots of other ideas, right? Well, I said this yesterday. That's how intellectual discourse works. People try a bunch of stuff, right? Then something sticks for whatever reason, and then people run with it, and then it explodes, right? Like you can draw family trees of ideas, and you're going to see at every stage, like in every century and every generation, a proliferation of ideas. Certain ones of them will then take off and proliferate. And so I think the very fact that the passages that are most akin to the classical Dharma or classical theory of karma and rebirth in the Upanishads aren't quite there and are found amidst a lot of other theories is indicative that this is at an earlier stage. So yeah, I don't, but even like I said, I think we need to take the continuities in the discourse seriously. I think there have been so many people in Indology that have not taken the intellectual discourse of Bandhu seriously. And this goes back to the, who was it called? The ravings of, there was really, really nasty, horrible things that were said about the Brahmanas, especially in the 19th century. And I think that legacy is not done. And that's why I particularly appreciate the work of Ioana she's written so much taking this discourse seriously. We need to do that. And so to me, that's just a fundamental methodological issue. The second question, do we end up at the same place? I sort of see what you mean, that it becomes a divide by other means, but I think those other means are important. For me, like I said, this is the way in which discourses develop, right? At any particular point in the discourse, any particular generation, there's going to be a proliferation of new ideas. And you can, roughly speaking, say that some of them are avant-garde, some of them are reactionary, some of them are, sort of middle of the road, right? And then, because of different power dynamics, certain segments will take off, right? I want to emphasize, by the way, and I say this for everyone, not just the participants, but also those who are observing. Like, when I label like the new Brahmanism, especially as articulated in the Dharma Sutras, as reactionary, I mean at that one point in history. Like, I want to make it very clear that we can't then re-essentialize this identity and say that for that reason, like the entire Brahmanical tradition from then on, or Hinduism, is reaction. Of course not, because then what you see come out of the new Brahmanism is a very creative and expansive tradition that, again, with every generation, produces avant-garde conservatism and reactionaries. This is what happens at every stage of the development of a discourse, of a culture. So I don't think, I do think what I'm saying is substantively different, in that it's recognizing that at every stage, identity is being re-articulated, in every generation, every century. You know, I agree with, I think, what Alex said yesterday, that the Greater Magadha hypothesis seems to be trying to essentialize differences that emerge out of contestation and debate in a geographical difference. And I don't think that I just don't think that that's necessary. So I do think we end up in different spots. Obviously, in a sense, we end up in the same spot because, like, the rest of the history of India has to come out of it either way. So in that sense, we end up in the same spot. But I think methodologically, it's quite different.
It's, you know, it's not my job to defend Johannes particularly, but, you know, Johannes has been writing about the chronology of the Vedic texts and the grammatical texts and other parts of the literature. I mean, you know, since his early orthoepic Diascuesis and other articles from the early 1980s. And in a way, I see the Greater Magadha book as being, or at least that third of the book devoted to chronology, as being a bringing together, and I think it is a bringing together of a lot of his, you know, thinking over 20, 30 years. And I think in many ways, the whole argument about Greater Magadha is based on that chronological rewriting. And I think sometimes we tend to treat the Greater Magadha thesis, you know, as if it's trying to, you know, diddle about and sort of reinterpret what the Upanishads say or something, but without taking completely seriously and at face value the fact that Johannes says the chronology is different. We've all been wrong all these years about the chronology. And if you take the chronological argument seriously, then you have to think differently about the evolution of ideas. And it's, I mean, Johannes, tell me if I'm wrong, but in many ways, I think it's that way round. And I still think that there's room to engage more critically with the chronological arguments. Johannes, have you got more you would like to add at this point?
That's a good, if I could just respond, that's a good point. And I think that the biggest problem was with absolute chronology. I mean, relative chronology is a different issue, but with absolute chronology, that's the biggest problem. And I think that the biggest point that Johannes makes there is related to Panini and what his language corresponds to. And so I'll just ask this, like, I mean, is it not possible that Panini's Sanskrit corresponding not to Upanishadic literature, but rather to Brahmanical literature could be a result of archaicizing? And maybe you already addressed this and I forgot, but I would be curious about that.
I think most of it is in a long chapter or in an appendix to the Greater Magadha book. If not, it also has come out in a long article in some felicitation volume. You can look it up. But I have actually spent a lot of time comparing Panini's prescriptions, or whatever they are, with Vedic usage. Was one of the very labor-intensive jobs of which I was very proud afterwards, because Paul Thieme had tried before the existence of the Vedic word index, and I, of course, could profit from the use of Vishwabandhu's word index, but it was still an enormous job. And I think the outcome left little doubts about the situation.
Yeah, I think that there's so many issues involved. I mean, because then it raises the issue, well, what about the chronology of the Buddhist texts? Like, are all the Buddhist texts that we're referring to as old as it's very complicated. So I want to absolutely honor the work that you've done, Johannes, especially with respect to Panini. I don't at all mean to ignore that. I think that ultimately it does have to do with could we ever make enough Vedic texts late enough to deny the continuities in thought between earlier Vedic thought and karma and karma and rebirth. Yeah.
Well, there is a lot of continuity. That sounds wrong what you say. I emphasize the continuity, but this little seed that is hidden in that continuity of thought, namely good acts lead to good rebirth, bad acts lead to bad research, that does not so easily fit into that continuity. The idea of karma has to be turned totally topsy-turvy. An ethical element, as someone emphasized, yes, had all of a sudden come into the world picture. And so the continuity is about the clothes that this idea wears in the texts we have. That is all very continuous. And I think that if anyone doubted that, they should have been convinced by some presentations at this conference. There's no doubt about that. But only this, at some point, a new idea comes in, as I see it. Well, we have talked about this enough, I think, perhaps.
I don't know if it's an exact parallel, but in the medical literature, there's a passage about the causation of epidemics and epidemic disease. And there's a long list of things are given, like the color of the sky and the sound of screaming in the wind and all sorts of features. And then in the middle of a long list, it says mosquitoes and rats. And it's wonderful. And, you know, as a medical historian, one jumps on top of that. It's fascinating. But it doesn't mean that they understood, you know, disease vectors at that time in history. It's a very acute observation, but it's mixed with other things. And it doesn't mean that there is a great scientific breakthrough. It's just that somebody noticed, okay, maybe that has something to do with it. I think I have to stop. I also wanted to say a few things, but I think maybe in the discussion session at the end, if there's time then. Nathan, a very stimulating talk. Thank you very, very much indeed. And Johannes, thank you for your responses, and everybody, Johanna, Philip, everyone. And I want to say a special thank you to Andrea, who has been waiting very patiently. I know from my own experience yesterday how, you know, and for all of us, how one is a little wound up before one's talk, and then if it gets a bit derailed because there's a delay, it just adds to the tension. So Andrea, I'm really grateful and very aware of your patience in allowing this extra time, I think nearly half an hour to pass from the scheduled time of your talk. So we will add this time to the end, which unfortunately will take it away from the conversation at the end of our conference, but never mind. We'll manage, we'll do what we like, but we certainly want to give you your full time. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Andrea Acri, who is a professor at the École Pratique des Hautes Études at PSL University in Paris, of course, and who will, I would like to invite now to speak to the issue of Monsoon Asian perspectives in the prehistory of Greater Magadha. Andrea, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Dominic. Actually, I can see that I can't share my screen.
Oh, beg your pardon. Oh, yes, I'm so sorry. Now you can.
Very good. Can you see it? Can you see my screen?
Yes, that's visible. Yes, very clear.
But I cannot make, maybe, sorry, I have a bit of a problem.
Take your time, it's fine.
Okay, I want to do this. Very good.
Yep, that's really good. That's very clear and good.
Yes, let me thank you, Dominic, for having organized this conference and for having invited me to present it. I've been thoroughly enjoying it and I've learned so much. So today I would like to bring in a perspective, let's say that carries some implications for the Greater Magadha hypothesis and vice versa as well. So it will be a talk about, not about Greater Magadha, but around Greater Magadha, if you wish. And okay, sorry. So as a trained Indologist who works on Southeast Asian material mainly and tantric traditions, I kind of like to bring in extended geographical perspective and also disciplinary perspective. Especially, I would like to start with some reflection on the area studies paradigm. So the kind of segregation of the discipline in geographical regions and self-contained fields of studies, which is a kind of artificial modern construct. Let me quote a paragraph by Daud Ali about indeed pre-modern cultural interactions, which are the way in which we conceptualize them often follows modern construct, nationalism or other cultural construct, rather than reflecting the actual cultural, economical, and political flows of the pre-modern world. I find this very instructive. So I think there is a need to bring together histories that have usually been viewed apart. There is also a need to reconceptualize the regions, and also need to reconceptualize the disciplines and uphold the real multidisciplinary approach. You can see that the slides are proceeding, right? Because sometimes it doesn't work. I assume, okay, I hope you're seeing that. Now, what about Greater Magadha and its prehistory? Now, as Professor Bronkhorst has already explained at the beginning, the Greater Magadha hypothesis is not a theory of immigration, about immigration. And yet the question of the substrate of linguistic, ethnic, or indeed the cultural matrix of this Brahmanical and non-Brahmanical civilization remains, right? So it is a truism to say that the Indian subcontinent was not a tabula rasa before the arrival of the Indo-Aryan language speakers, but it is worth repeating. Now, the problem is that we have scant evidence of pre-Vedic, pre-Brahmanical religions in India. As we all know, we only have relatively late texts, scant archaeological remains. Now, I think we need to push a bit the boundaries of scholarship, and as Professor Bronkhorst and other participants have already remarked, we can only formulate theories, and then some can disprove them, or we may also fine-tune them rather than totally disprove them, and then science advances. And I think this is also my own approach, by the way. Most of what I'm going to present is rather speculative, I admit, but I like to play with these concepts and to have your feedback also. So I think that here, in some respects, well, we can say that inference may be a viable scholarly method, right, to make assumptions between religious substratum of India. For instance, if we don't find certain elements, well, it follows that they must have been imported from somewhere else. Of course, there are problems, I'm very well aware. Now, this is a methodology, I think, that has been used by some to compare Vedic religion with other Indo-European, pre-modern religions of the Indo-European speaking world, right? Not only religion, but also mythology, material culture, etc. Well, one can say if the idea of transmigration or indeed asceticism are not found in Vedic religion and are also not found in Greece, for example. Okay, I know about Pythagoras, but are not found in the Roman world, etc. Then they must have come from somewhere else. I'm oversimplifying, of course. Now, Patrick Oliver has made an interesting observation that the kind of cultural processes cannot be reified into two separate realities called Vedic and non-Vedic, or Brahmanical and non-Brahmanical, and I tend to agree with this, but then I also think that this does not necessarily disprove the Greater Magadha hypothesis. Rather, it may fine-tune it. It may suggest that, well, to me at least, Vedic culture was already hybrid, right? I take that dating is important, periodization is important, but I have no problem in saying that even the Rig Veda is itself already doesn't reflect actually the pure Vedic, whatever it was, Indo-Aryan situation. I'm more inclined to think about cross-cultural negotiations and the contribution of various strands, substratal or not, to the constitution of Brahmanical cultures as we know them. So basically, the problem is that we have no terminology. We have this greater Magadha idea. We have linguistics that study Dravidian, Austroasiatic languages, etc. Now, moving on to classical Hinduism and medieval Shaiva Buddhist traditions, which is my field, my main field. I think we can make similar consideration. It all boils down to this orthogenetic versus heterogenetic model, right? We all know what this is. Now, the first orthogenetic champions this perception of a kind of more or less linear development, right, of Vedic religion, driven by Brahmins, and this strikes me as a rather reductionist paradigms. Cultures are not self-contained, right? Then we can see influences, contribution to non-Aryan cults and practices, right? And this would be the heterogenetic model. And a very powerful idea, I think, and Professor Broncos has contributed a lot to this, is the idea of the seeing Brahmanical civilization as really a kind of master of appropriating the appropriation and inclusion of non-Vedic heterogeneous cultural streams, ideas, etc. Right? So the Brahmanical texts clearly betray adaptation and repackaging of features from their surroundings. And let me say that this was, I think, the reason why Brahmanism was so successful in Southeast Asia, because it could adapt and adopt. It could actually repackage many of the cultural configuration it encountered, especially in Southeast Asia, even without a military conquest, as we know. Now, the question remains, what was the substratum of Greater Magadha, of Northern India? What exactly the Indo-Aryan culture appropriated, etc. So let me try to embark on a Dumezilian project by looking east, not to the Indo-European world, but rather east. Can we reconstruct or trace some element by looking at the margins, social, geographical, and so try to see shared features and make assumptions about substrata. So I don't like the word substratum because it invokes, it kind of reflects a static. I'm not imagining this as a static, but rather dynamic negotiation, a matrix, if you wish. So the very important concept for me is that we call Indian, Indic, Brahmanical, whatever, Vedic is already a melange, a mix of heterogeneous cultural elements with a long cultural and social history and an extended geography. This is something I want to stress today. So if you limit the scope to North India or even South Asia, I'm not sure it may be helpful in some way, but it doesn't totally give us the big picture. And the big picture, as I try to conceptualize it through maps like this, is indeed to imagine the area, a more extended area of Monsoon Asia. This definition was elaborated by geographers, actually early 20th century French geographers, and also not only from France, and adopted nowadays by scholars in the field of environmental studies, for example. So I see this Monsoon Asia as a heuristic tool. We can also use the Indo-Malaya ecozone, and we can also see an old map. For example, if you see the map below, it calls India an area that actually includes not only India, but also part of Southeast Asia, right? So these maps are very, tell us something interesting about the period, which produced them. Okay, so the next slide. So this is the Indo-Malaya ecozone. And Craig Reynolds, a scholar of mainland Southeast Asia, actually spoke about a geo-environmental metaphor of Monsoon Asia. As I say, this is the idea of applied by early 20th century scholars. This is a region with a very high number of linguistic pillars, so the Indo-Aryan, Dravidian, Austroasiatic, Austronesian, Tibeto-Burman. It is indeed the homeland of Austroasiatic, Austronesian, Tibeto-Burman languages. It is also the theater of early human population and migrations, and very early also human populations. It is also the place probably where navigation was developed first. It is beyond, beyond a mix, above all, a mix of cultural packages, and also genes, languages, technologies, domestic animals, and crops. It's a huge contact zone, basically, which has some coherence, I think. And it is useful to talk about Monsoon Asia, as we now, many scholars talk about Eurasia, for example, as a kind of network, as an interconnected zone. Now, this area was also important in not just the proto and prehistoric period, but also in the historical period for cosmopolitan processes that we all know. For example, it was the theater of Indianization, or Sanskrit cosmopolis, whatever you want to call it. And I'm drawing here from the work of Ian Sinclair, who noted interesting correspondences between the diffusion of Sanskrit language proficiency and the Indo-Malay ecozone, and the Buddhist epigraphy actually stops at the Wallace line. It actually neatly corresponds to the green area, to the Indo-Malay ecozone, and then the blue also area to some extent, Pseudo-Sanskrit epigraphy. It's very interesting, I think, to make this, this geo-environmental comparison with cultural and geo-environmental elements. This is something quite interesting, I think. Now, scholars of Southeast Asia, including archaeologist Pierre Mangan, are stressing that indeed there was a relationship between the culture of Southeast Asia and of South Asia well before what we call Indianization. So the first historical evidence of contacts, of texts, inscriptions, etc. Other scholars like Hermann Kulke have elaborated theories about the existence of some sort of converging developments or parallel developments across the Bay of Bengal. So it is important today to transcend this monodirectional center versus periphery paradigm that still dominates, I would say, shapes much of the intellectual discourse on the interaction between South and Southeast Asia. And also extended not just to South and Southeast Asia, but to a wider area. There are still many questions to be answered. So what were the flows and interactions across and beyond Southeast Asia? What were the dynamics before and beyond Indianization? And most importantly, can we try to conceptualize some kind of shared cultural matrix, or at least cultural networks that indeed extended over a wide geographically wide area before Indianization? Now, French scholars like Sylvain Lévy, Jean Pelouzzi, especially Paul Mus, elaborated the idea of a cultural substratum, which they call Austric or Austroasiatic, in Monsoon Asia. Especially Paul Mus, I like very much to quote this paragraph of his work on Monsoon Asia, about to give the idea of the interconnected nature of this region. We often think about history in terms and context in terms of land masses, but the sea was a very important unifying element. So it is really no problem to imagine long distance contacts between population in this geographical theater at a very, very early stage of human history. All right, so basically he kind of elaborates this hypothesis, talking about a religion, expressing the concept of a religion of Monsoon zone of Asia as making more sense than to speak about an Indian religion. Now, Joseph Des, the famous historian of Southeast Asia, actually subscribed to this theory, rather surprisingly. In fact, he states that the civilizations of Southeast Asia already had traits in common with the civilization of pre-Aryan India. Right? So they were not savages with the Aryanized Indians civilized, but there was some sort of cultural base common to all of Monsoon Asia. Later scholars have not quite subscribed to that idea, but elaborated also similar concepts. For example, they have, let's say, rejected the dichotomy between South and Southeast Asia in the pre-modern period, such as Magadha. And also Sheldon Pollock, who made a very important statement that indeed in the first millennium, it makes hardly more sense to distinguish between South and Southeast Asia than between North India and South India, in spite of our indeed area study influence perspectives. Now, Monsoon Asia, as I said, through the maritime corridors, form a natural space that favor the movement of people, commodities, languages, and ideas. And recent research, archaeological, genetic, is actually uncovering these contacts and similarities, not only in terms of material culture, but also religious tropes. For example, archaeological evidence has been recently unearthed about the existence, that suggests the existence of a prehistoric maritime Silk Road that constituted an interaction sphere, which went all the way across the Indian Ocean, already from 3000 BCE. Then other studies have also highlighted maritime long-distance links between early farming communities in South and Southeast Asia and Southern China. So basically, there is also the possibility, I think, that ideas, religious ideas, were shared, not only in material culture. We know, for example, about these jar barayas, about the boat-shaped houses in both Southeast Asia and Eastern India. There are many other elements. Roger Blanch speaks about an arc of viticulture as early as 10,000 before the present, that basically stretches from Melanesia to Nepal and correlates with linguistics and perhaps also ideas. There are indeed many, we can talk a lot about this natural, flora, cultigens that were exchanged and moved with certain people, in this area. And also there have been studies about ancestral worship, buffalo sacrifices, tree deity cults, Naga cults, which are common to in both South and Southeast Asia, sacralization of natural features, etc. These are very impressionistic things. I cannot talk about them today, but just something to keep in mind. Now, the dispersal of Austronesian-speaking people across southern China or Taiwan to Southeast Asia and the Pacific, not to Madagascar, to my mind, actually parallels the dispersal of Indo-European speaking people from the West, the Indian subcontinent into the Indian subcontinent. So we have similar dynamics of population replacement. In fact, the earliest stock of this area was probably made by Austroasiatic speaking people. For example, in Insular Southeast Asia, these Austroasiatic speaking people have been replaced by Austronesians. And it's not just about languages and different ethnic groups, but also social cultural packages, I think. Now, this is a map of the languages that we have already seen in previous presentations. We all know that, as also John Peterson has discussed, Austroasiatic languages are spoken in India and were spoken long ago. And what is important to note is that Austroasiatic people actually arrived in the Indian subcontinent from somewhere else. Now, John Peterson has applied this well-tested methodology that allow us to reconstruct certain features of the languages. In any event, suggests that the Austroasiatic languages were actually spread over a wider area. And what is interesting in that is that this area seems to overlap with the cultural entity that Johannes Bronkhorst has called Greater Magadha, quite neatly. This is a very important, I think, discovery, which has made in a totally independent manner. Now, is it possible then that the culture, the advanced culture of Greater Magadha, owed to a predominantly Austroasiatic speaking substratum? This is a very interesting question that I think we should pursue. And I repeat, it is kind of ironic that the Austroasiatic speaking population of today, a small scale, well, I don't say small scale societies because there are millions of them, are called Adivasi. They are not Adivasi, they may be, but they are not aboriginals. They are immigrants in a certain way. And this is the article that Professor Peterson has already mentioned by Rao and Sidwell, showing the arrival, indeed the vectors of the arrival of Austroasiatic language-speaking people into the subcontinent. Now, I think this is actually important. It bears implication for the substratum of Greater Magadha. And it is now recognized that the origin of Austroasiatic languages was somewhere in between Southeast Asia and southern China. And it appears likely, indeed, that Austroasiatic people traveled from there to the Indian subcontinent, both via the overland corridor in northeastern India, but also via the maritime corridor through the Andaman Islands and then to Orissa at an undetermined time in antiquity, but probably around, sorry, I cannot see here, but I guess it must be around, I'm actually not sure, 3000 or something like that. Anyway, I'm not an expert in linguistics, so I'm not really sure, but it is actually, what is important to stress is that other research, no, sorry, okay. So basically traces of this culture can be found in the, for example, in the borrowings, linguistic borrowings that we find in Sanskrit, mainly related to agriculture. And also there are parallels in the Chalcolithic and other period archaeological features of material culture. Now, what is important to stress is that recent genetic research suggests that the descendants actually are, the Austroasiatic language speaking people resemble a very old genetic stock, a very old population of the Indian subcontinent that is called ancestral South Asians, South Indians, sorry, I think it's ancestral South Asians, whose genetic pool is related to that of the Andaman Islands. So this is a quite old population of the Indian subcontinent indeed. So there is no question, I think, that the Austroasiatic languages originated in India, but it's rather the other way around. They originated from somewhere else. Now, as Professor Broncos has noted, early Brahmanical literature speaks about demonic people inhabiting the regions in the east, Greater Magadha. So these are Asura worshipping, demon-looking, barbarous, etc. This is quite suggestive. Now, I know very well we have to be very cautious when we may establish links between culture and language, and especially ethnic groups. But I think we often do when we speak, for example, of the Indianization of Southeast Asia. We are all implying that the carriers, that the Sanskrit speakers, were also carriers of a sophisticated culture. They may have been Brahmins, but Indian Brahmins, they also may have been Southeast Asians. Now, can we again go back to this? I'd like to go back to this Dumezilian project and also revisit Moose ideas. Is it possible to reconstruct some elements of this early culture that by looking at this marginal context of what has survived and try to go back in time? I know this is very, very dangerous, but it is a rather bold attempt. But I think a similar methodology has been applied by anthropologists, archaeologists, for example, in the Comparative Austronesian project. They are basically researching contemporary cultures, society in the Austronesian-speaking world, and reconstruct an Austronesian cultural complex. Could be Proto-Austronesian language, but also some features of religion, for instance, of a social organization. Now, other scholars have already attempted to do so, or at least have tried to, let's say, continue Moose's approach. For example, John Imig, when studying masked performance from Bali and Orissa. I like very much these paragraphs, actually, as speculative as they may be. What is important to take home here is really the reassessment that needs to be made, I think, to the contribution of the Dravidian populations, Austroasiatic population, to the classical Indian culture, what we call classical, Brahmanical, etc. and about the fact of explaining certain features that have been seen as manifestation of Tantra as having roots that go back further in time and may go back indeed to previous civilizational configurations. And again, as he states, this is a region that had thousands of years of a partially shared prehistory. Roy Jordan and Robert Bessing have also taken up the Monsoon Asian perspective when discussing the construction sacrifice in India, again, this kind of tantric idea about founding sacrifices to be performed during the founding of monuments. And rather than seeing them as local developments, appropriation or variants of Indian tantric practices, they've actually regarded them as, well, they have regarded the Indian usages as variants, local variants of other prevailing, pre-existing modes, pre-existing cultural features. And this is an interesting approach. Now, the most interesting for me as a historian of religions is the approach by Robert Denton, an anthropologist, a leading anthropologist of the Semai, of this small-scale society in the Peninsular Malaysia, Austroasiatic speakers, who in a series of articles actually proposed a speculative, by his own admission, reconstruction of semi-theological histories. Theological history, which suggests that serious students of Buddhism, Taoism, etc., needs to pay attention, Hinduism, needs to pay attention to the indigenous religions of Peninsular Malaysia. Now, Denton discussed some interesting and uncanny similarities between Rudra and the deity Go, so the high god of the Semai, a dark lord actually, and suggested that the two figures, rather than being respectively ancestor and descendant, are cousins, developments of a primordial religion that stretched from Eastern India to Southern China. So basically, he is revisiting Paul Musse's approach. Now, this kind of goes against prevalent views that basically interprets any similarities as influence from India on Southeast Asia, and the appropriation of Shaivism, for instance, on a layer, so a kind of cultural layering, and the kind of appropriation, right, by population in Southeast Asia of Indian religions, and then the creation of embedded developments of cults, spirit cults, that survived along the new religious ideas. So this is exactly not kind of, goes very much against this view. And he suggests a contrary process that involves the internal differentiation of an unformalized and unnamed Aboriginal religion, which was spread over across Monsoon Asia. And the subsequent convergence. So there were multiple waves and multiple directions in the first millennium, right? So basically he thinks that it's true, Hinduism, Tantra was exported, so to speak, from India, but the ultimate origin might not have been in India itself. And well, so this is kind of, again, the implications are that these Semai are Austroasiatic people speaking the same languages spoken by these pockets, big pockets, but still pockets of Austroasiatic speakers in the Indian subcontinent. So do these people share common origins? They do, genetically, linguistically. Do they also have similar, they might have had probably similar religions. So Denton challenges the reader with a series of questions. You can read yourself. It speaks about this god of this kind of pre-modern as some sort of reflecting a phenomenon of pre-modern globalization. Did ancient Monsoon Asia share a common religious matrix? So the main features for him would be a high storm god, feared but not worshipped, exactly as it happens in the case of Rudra in the early Vedic corpus. A notion of shamanic power embodied in demon wives, the use of blood in certain rituals, and also the sacred plants, or a religion of sacred plants, and a cult of tonic serpents or nagas. It is important to know that Denton individuates a set of core versus outer features. The outer features are actually the result of Hinduization, perhaps, but the core features are very unlikely. These are societies that have changed very, very little. They have been basically isolated on the mountains from the context. They have absorbed, of course, they have interacted with other people, but they have basically they're quite static socially and culturally speaking. So basically, he sees Mpu and the Vedic Rudra as the precursors to Shiva of classical Hinduism. So now the point is, can we hunt for substratal elements in classical Hinduism and early Shaivism? I think it would be an interesting project, and I have started to gather some preliminary evidence. For example, Austroasiatic with a question mark, we can say non-Indo-Aryan substratal words associated with early Shaiva cultic milieu, for instance, is Laguda, etc., associated with Lakulisha. The very important figures for Pashupatas. The word Pishacha and all the lore connected to this host of demons, which exists also in Semite religion. A certain name of plants, Udumbara, for instance, which is probably related to Tumburu and early Rudra. There are also other parallels noted by Denton himself, for instance, the 7 Kritikas, which probably are connected to the Matris, whose names are, some of whose names are non-Indo-European origins, Ulabula, Nitarnichu, Punika. And the others, 4 of them, have roots connected to water, rain, and cloud, which will bring me to my next point about the monsoonal culture. Now, there is also some kind of mythological complex here. So the Kritikas are the mothers of Kumara. We know Kumara is connected to a Shaiva cultic milieu. He's in fact the son of Shiva. And so there is some kind of monsoonal complex there also that we can discern. Now, there is also the early tantric texts also have preserved evidence of the cult of trees, and especially association with certain gods, demons, and Rudras. And of course, Nagas. I think Nagas are very important in both India and Southeast Asia. And so they both, in India, quite clearly, they probably belong to a substratum, the substratal religion. It was appropriated by Buddhism. And so it is possible to see this as a pre-existing feature in both areas. Now, there could be a lot of interesting work to be done by anthropologists about the so-called shamanic practices of Austroasiatic speaking populations of India, like possessions, healing, etc., that really kind of have shared elements with practices which are prevalent in Southeast Asia as well. There are also interesting comparisons, analogies with the Bhuta Tantras, with this early tantric corpus of texts that also contains a lot of information about such rituals, and about the figure of Rudra, basically, the figure of the high god of these populations that seem to have kind of qualities, that seem to have indeed formed some kind of resilient trope. Also very important in conceptualization of power as female, which we have seen exist in the Semite society, and mirrors, somehow I think mirrors the same concept we find in tantric literature. For example, the yoginis, this kind of female power and powerful semi-deities who can bestow supernatural power. A lot can be said also about blood offerings. And it is interesting to know that the yogini temples are actually most well attested in areas which were possibly, well, definitely non-Indo-Aryan. They were kind of peripheral to the Indo-Aryan linguistic and cultural area. Now, a careful scholar such as Peter Biscoff, an authority in Shaivism, in his entry in the British Encyclopedia of Hinduism, states that indeed the origin of Rudra is still debated, and the interesting question is still whether Rudra, constitutes a development, kind of orthogenetic development from the Indo-Aryan culture, or rather is to be seen as coming from somewhere else, having been appropriated from somewhere else. And he concludes that Rudra is probably reflects a complex cultural background in which both Vedic and extra-Vedic elements have played a role. So this is enough for me actually to hope that well, the issue is far from being settled, and there might be evidence of Rudra having been appropriated from another culture, not the Indo-Aryan culture. And this is, I think, it could be a also very useful approach to adopt when we study Pashupatism. It's, I think, very clear. It's a very paradoxical system that strikes me as a Brahmanical appropriation of this maybe Shramana, I don't know, but pre-existing practices that were quite alien to Brahmanism. And I think I can see quite a lot of these elements that are not quite Brahmanical. And yesterday we already mentioned this. There is a link between Rudra and the Vratyas. So I don't know, I don't want to go into enter that debate, but it is something interesting to be explored further, I think. I cannot resist mentioning something that was mentioned yesterday, for example, about this the rituals described in Pali text about yaksha possessing people. We find quite a lot of such descriptions actually. For example, for instance, Ronald Davidson has traced back to the Pali Canon, at least has interpreted some descriptions found in the Pali Canon as traces of Kapalika practices, so kind of tantric practices, which owe their roots to their origin to pre-tantric sources. Also, the idea by Obeya Sekere that this idea of rebirth is widespread among small-scale societies, but in a kind of non-ethicized way. It's quite interesting. So are we dealing with some sort of indeed ancestral religion? Now, one final point I want to make is about this the work by Gautama Vajracharya, who wrote a book about the Monsoon culture. And you may agree or not with him, but I think he has a point. He actually notes a growing importance of the Monsoon in Indo-Aryan culture. So basically, as the Indo-Aryans moved towards the Ganges in the Indian subcontinent, you note more attention being paid to certain themes which are obviously important in monsoonal society, not so in the kind of pastoral societies you find in the Indo-European, Western, Indian, Central Asian society, especially the stress on rain and other elements. So you may not agree with this reinterpretation of these Vedic myths, but I think he has a point and kind of summarize all the points. But this brings, I think, it's connected to the problem of Greater Magadha and the substratum of India. And could this monsoonal culture have extended beyond the borders of the Indian subcontinent? For instance, the importance of water, the fascination with the destroyer, so the kind of fierce aspect of the godhead in an area which is very prone to cataclysms, to some sort of natural disasters. I would close with a paragraph by Geoffrey Samuel that I like very much, and especially the final part, the parts which are in bold. And I think for Indologists, indeed, it is often well, it's a good exercise to think beyond the boundaries indeed of South Asia, which are the outcome of, again, Western academic paradigms, and think about complex processes within a common frame, right? And he quite rightly remarks that we need a quite different sort of geography, and I would say also history, to make sense of these difficult problems for which indeed we need to make some speculations. And so let me conclude. Basically, the remaining problems are what was the linguistic substratum of Greater Magadha? Was it Austroasiatic, Dravidian, or something else? And could this be important to, well, fine-tune, to confirm the hypothesis or fine-tune it? Did this correspond to a cultural substratum or substrata, indeed, and different strands, cultural strands that existed in northern India? Again, we can fine-tune the hypothesis by postulating not a monolithic civilization, but rather imagining more dynamic processes. Greater Kosovo, for example, has been mentioned yesterday. Very interesting. Yes, we can imagine multiple entities. We can go back, we can also imagine these things as not necessarily the expression of the Greater Magadhan culture, but some kind of pre-existing non-Vedic practices that even were, you know, perhaps not even approved by the Greater Magadhans. I don't know, but there must have been something there, right? And this something I fail to kind of think that it completely disappeared. Traces of it must have survived. And also then we can ask, is it possible that these elements were shared with populations outside of the Indian subcontinent? And could this help us to make sense of, for example, the spread of Brahmanism or the similarity in culture, the adoption of Sanskrit and Indian religions so widespread and so deep in Southeast Asia? I think we can make sense of this only if we assume some kind of common ground, right, that made possible dialogues and exchanges. Again, I repeat, so what we conceptualize as Indian is actually the outcome, the result of heterogeneous cultural elements, of long process of negotiation and a long culture and social history and a complex geography. I don't want to indulge in self-promotion, but if you're interested in this, I co-edited with two colleagues a book, and so I kind of sketch this theory there if you want to read more about that. And of course, this is just, I repeat, very speculative. I like to play with these ideas, but I think they're promising. More research is needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Yes, wonderful. And I think you draw attention to the very appropriately to this long prehistory of connected cultures and histories across a much wider geographical area than we usually consider. So thank you very much indeed. Yes, Nathan, you have your hand up.
Hi, thank you for that, Andrea. I really appreciate that. I just wanted to I guess clarify a couple things. So if I understand your theory correctly, you're identifying this oh, well, first of all, I want to say, love the Southern Asia approach. Everybody should study Southern Asia. We need to get out of these silos. But the monsoonal culture that you're talking about, it sounds like you're particularly identifying it with speaking Austroasiatic languages. And I'm wondering, so if we bring this back to the specific Greater Magadha issue, right? Are you saying that, and this might get back to what I think, was it John was talking about the other day? That are you saying that because obviously there were substrata for all Indo-Aryan speakers in South Asia, right? So are you saying that monsoon culture of the Austroasiatic speakers was more Eastern and different from the substratum further west, and that could explain certain differences? I'm just trying to goad you a little bit. Is that what you're trying to say? And if so, like what difference would that difference make? And also, when would it have happened? I mean, like, how long were I mean, it seems to me that even pretty far east, the dominance of Indo-Aryan was pretty early. So anyway, I was wondering if you could speak about that a little bit.
Yes, thank you, Nathan. Well, I would say that it must have been definitely earlier than the arrival of the Indo-Aryan speakers. I tend to imagine, as you know, previous scholars have done, not myself, to call this Austroasiatic. They call it Austric, I call it Austroasiatic, simply before this is really one of the oldest populations in the area. It is a substratal population, like in terms of language, in many areas. It is connected to, you know, very important early developments. Again, navigation. They were the first navigators, basically, it seems. Those who transfer certain important, you know, crops, for example. They seem to really have provided some sort of, and they were wiped out. I mean, they basically were, you know, wiped out by, let's say, other, you know, people who became dominant, and I don't know exactly why, but it seems to have happened in many areas. So I tend to link, yeah, to think about this substratum in terms of this population. And nothing says that, you know, maybe the Dravidians were also, you know, played a role, or there were other populations we don't know about. I don't have a problem with that. Again, it's a theory, and but I am interested in what was there before and whether there are common configurations or common routes indeed across the Bay of Bengal and even further, southern China, for example. It was incredibly important. And southern China is not Chinese like Han, you know. Southern China was mostly Austronesian, Austroasiatic, etc. So it was an expression of a different culture. I don't know if that answers your question. Probably I can't, because I mean, I cannot answer your question, but these are my ideas.
Thank you very much. Jason, you have your hand up.
Yes, so hopefully you can hear me okay. Yes, thank you very much, Andrea, for a very helpful, you know, and stimulating presentation of a variety of resources and references where we can explore further these issues of cultural interaction across Monsoon Asia. My question has to do with the substrata, which, you know, we could call indigenous or Austroasiatic, or, you know, just a range of substrata of what was there before. And I'm wondering, how does that identification of substrata affect not only our understanding of questions of samsara and karmic retribution, which is, of course, the issue we've been discussing for the past 4 days. And now you bring in the question of, you know, a Rudra Shiva interface that's also been a problem, you know, for, which is an open question, as you point out, for, you know, how does that fit into how do those range of practices fit into the Veda? But I'm wondering about an old idea that I found attributed to de la Poussin by Etienne Lamotte in the History of Indian Buddhism, that there was an ancient Indian yoga that is from the same source as what you know, de la Poussin thought was the Brahmanism from which Buddhism sprang, but not the Brahmanism of the you know, of the Brahmana and the Upanishad. And I just know I'm not only asking you this question, but I'm also asking this question to other experts who we have on this panel, and, you know, the history of yoga and so forth. But is there a kind of do you see a kind of nexus between Rudra Shiva, you know, extra Vedic practices or ideas, yoga, and a possible shared in, you know, substrata for these ideas of, you know, rebirth and karmic retribution?
All right. Oh gosh, what a question. I mean, I wish I could answer it. I mean, I don't want to go into the debate about the origins of yoga. I am kind of convinced by Bronkhorst's arguments. I kind of think that there needs to be some fine tuning. For example, James Monsoon, and others sort of accept partly this idea and also bring in other elements like this dialogue between Shramanas and Tapaswin, early. So I'm quite well. I tend to think that the yoga, what became yoga, has roots that they go beyond the strictly speaking, Vedic. I don't know if this is connected to the issue of Rudra, which is another difficult issue, but I'm most interested in that because as a scholar of Tantra, I'm, let's say, interested in the heterogenetic approach, and I find it rather difficult to believe that the development of Tantra and many features we can see in there, which do not quite compute with Brahmanism, do not quite make sense in a Brahmanical framework, are just, developments, orthogenetic developments of Brahmanism, of Vedic religion. I think Rudra is the outsider god par excellence, the storm god, and all the mythological complex around him warrants some kind of should prompt us to look for a possible substrate of, origins. And I think it kind of makes sense to look for them in precisely in this indigenous, you call it, or whatever, and among the populations that nowadays are still in India and that are practicing also some what we call popular religion or shamanic religions. So to me, it sounds possible and promising. More than this, I cannot say. Yeah.
Philip, would you like to come in?
Yes, I mean, I felt in a way urged to say something about the origin of yoga because this question came up, but I could maybe also leave this for the final discussion and here put a brief remark to what Andrea actually said about the cult of Nagas and dragons as being characteristic for this Monsoon culture. Because we see a very, how should I say, close connection between these Nagas and yoga. Patanjali is seen as an incarnation of Shesha, which is a snake. The Buddha was protected by Muchalinda in the night of his meditation, according to the legend. So yes, maybe there is a connection also between the Monsoon culture and the religion of Greater Magadha, or the culture of Greater Magadha, and the interrelation between the idea of karma, rebirth, samsara, and Nagas that protect those who undertake this endeavor to leave samsara.
Please say something about the early history of yoga now.
Okay. Yes. Okay. We could, of course, have a whole conference about this topic, and I think some of the discussions that we have would be repeated there, because when we look at yoga, at classical yoga, at Patanjali yoga, we can identify certain traits from the Brahmanical background. For example, mantra repetition, breath control, pranayama, but the intellectual framework, that is, of course, very close to the ideas of karma and rebirth, as they are characteristic for the culture of Greater Magadha. And an important, and I would say one of the most important intellectual streams on which Patanjali drew when he created his Patanjali Yoga Shastra is Buddhism. that had been seen by Johannes Bronckhorst, yeah, by many others. I have published an article about Sarvastivada Buddhism, theories of meditation, all this. You have a full range of Buddhist terminology popping up in Patanjali Yoga. And this, in my view, supports Johannes Bronckhorst's theory very well, because if there would have been something like a Brahmanical form of yoga at that time when Patanjali created his Patanjali Yoga Shastra, that is at the beginning of the 5th century, end of the 4th century, then he could have easily taken this material to create his Patanjali Yoga Shastra, but it took Buddhist ideas because probably there was nothing else to draw upon when it came to the practice of spiritual liberation by means of meditation. Yeah, so that was what I could say in
Thank you.
brief.
Thank you. Johanna, yes.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk, and just a brief, not short comment. As you know, I am willing to look into Vedic culture as the beginnings of many later processes, but I found your paper very interesting because so your presentation, because many of elements, called elements you mentioned, I somehow cannot, and they really cannot identify it in the Veda. For example, in Taittiriya Samhita, you were talking about Rudra. There is this Shatarudriya, this litany to Rudra, and Rudra is described as coming with a host of very strange beings, and really there is nothing in the Veda which could make me think that it was something from within tradition. So I like this very much, and I also think, well, I about yoga, maybe really we could someone could organize a conference, because I could add some things from Vedic point of view. And I have one little question which goes beyond the present topic. You mentioned navigators, and are you also interested in Micronesian navigators? Are there any connection between those navigators and those who are far to the east or west? I don't know. I have read just a wonderful book by East is a Big Bird, Navigation and Logic on Pululovat Atoll by Thomas Gladwin, and he shows how really those people were clever in navigation and the way how they perceive the world. So it was just I just wanted to ask you about this, if you know something about any connections between those people, or it is not known at all, or it is just beyond your interest.
Okay, very briefly, I can say that probably goes to, reflects a later stage of Austronesian navigation. Which I'm not saying is not interesting or earlier, because Austronesians were the best navigators. They colonized the entire Pacific and reached even,
So they were earlier.
So it's probably not the early navigation I intend here, but definitely there is that area is also interesting, and this. Okay. And that's my answer.
There's a marvelous book from 20 years ago by David Turnbull, Masons, Tricksters and Cartographers, which talks about the early Micronesian navigation skills, and also ties it together with the idea of indigenous knowledges. It's still not it's not projecting things into a deep past, but nevertheless suggests that there are local knowledges that have deep roots within local cultures.
Would you write the title of the book on the chat? Thank you.
I will, yes.
Thank you.
Johannes, your hand has been up for a while. Sorry, we get to you now.
Sorry. Just a small addition to what Philip just said, with which I fully agree. But people talk so easily about the history of the origin of yoga, and I would then like to ask, Are you talking about what the Indian texts call yoga or what the modern Westerner calls yoga? And of course, for the early period, the word yoga is used not all that much. The early Buddhist texts don't use it, and they start using it only with yogachara, as far as I know. They don't call their practices yoga. And when the Brahmanical texts use the word yoga, they refer to the ascetic kind of practices which I associate with Greater Magadha, that means with an emphasis on immobilization. And so if people, as they sometimes do, use yoga, use the word yoga when they talk about whatever else that seems to them outlandish or ascetic, then, well, fine, they can do so, but perhaps they should not use the word yoga, which might be misleading. I've once written a small article in which I said the main contribution of Brahmanism to yoga is the term yoga. And I think that is actually the case.
Okay. Well, unless I'm misreading the room, I think there's a moment here of a natural pause. So I propose that we have a 5-minute break. We're getting quite close to the end of the meeting altogether. We have just another half an hour, but let's take 5 minutes off. And when we reconvene, I will read a short contribution from Asko Parpola, and then we can have more conversation and try to bring in as much as we can from the contributions and questions from the attendees who are listening. So I'll see everybody again in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Hey, Dominic, can I ask you something?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, you mentioned that Johannes had his hand up for a while and I couldn't see that. Where can I raise my hand digitally here?
So
I
on the
normally have it, but I can't find it today.
So on the bottom of my screen, I have a series of icons with a
Yeah.
green one in the middle saying share screen.
Yeah.
And 3 to the right of that, I've got a raise hand button.
Okay. I don't have that. I just have a record button. I've never had this format on Zoom before that I have here.
Have you got another sort of round button with sort of like
Record.
emojis?
No, not on this version.
And
more? Do you have more?
Three dots to the far right with more?
I usually have that on Zoom, but not for some reason, not here. That's why I keep raising my hand.
Yes, yes. It's
Okay.
a little puzzling. I don't understand, but
I don't either. I have a record button here, which I never have otherwise.
I've also noticed that with Zoom pushes out software updates, almost once a week. So it's worth checking that you're on the latest release. The other thing I've noticed is that some of their releases seem to either cause or I don't know what, but there seems to be sometimes a step back in functionality. It's so I've noticed that, I have somewhere or other in the maze of software, I've got my little photograph on the top right of the screen for when I switch off my video, and with some updates that stops working. And then it's just my name in black and white again. And so then I have to reinstate it. So there's a few little funny glitches about versions. So that could be what's going on. Yeah.
We get ours via the university here, and it's just when I'm here for some reason. Okay, it's not important.
Yes. Well, welcome back, everybody, and thank you for being here. And so I would like to address an issue here, a couple of issues here about people that aren't here contributing with us today, who aren't actually part of the symposium. And I'd like to mention particularly Tom Hopkins, who, sorry to say, passed away not long ago, but who was for many years the teacher of Indian religions at Franklin and Marshall College, and the author of a very popular and widely used book in North American teaching called The Hindu Religious Tradition. And Tom had actually had a series of conversations, more or less by accident, with Jeffrey Samuel some years ago that got recorded in Jeffrey's book, The History of Yoga and Tantra. And we know mostly about Tom's views through Jeffrey's description of them. At the same time, Tom sent a very long typescript manuscript to Jeffrey, and then subsequently a second one, both of them hundreds of pages long, basically describing the early history of mid-first millennium Ganges Valley, and basing his discussions mainly on archaeological and early urbanization data, and coming to a very similar conclusion about two cultures. As you know, in Jeffrey's book, Jeffrey talks also about the different the lunar and solar Vangshas, and uses that idea. Well, I just regret that Tom never published his work. I have copies of it. It is very conversational, and it's not strongly footnoted. It's not ready for publication, but it's a major contribution, I think, into this discussion that really hasn't. Well, it's partly seen the public through Jeffrey's intermediate in mediation. And I'm very sorry that Jeffrey himself couldn't be with us as well, because he's obviously thought a lot about these issues and written about them very, very well, I think. So I invited him, but he's now retired, and although he's still very active and so forth, but he wasn't able to participate here. I also asked Asko Parpola to participate here, and Asko has said also he wasn't able to, but has provided a short statement of a page and a half, which I will share with everybody in a moment. And finally, I want to address this issue about Slido, which we're using for our, to try and mediate comments from the public who are watching our proceedings. And I completely understand it's like trying to write a trying to write a PhD thesis using only Twitter. It's a very short medium. There's a strong limit. If we had paid for an expensive license fee, then we could have chosen to extend the word limit on those messages. But as it is, it's not just a question of money, it's also a question of attention, cognitive power, where we can't concentrate on everything and what's going past in a comment feed at the same time as each other's talks and questions and answers. So I'm fully aware that a number of very serious thinkers about these issues have felt quite frustrated that they can only, sort of put questions into Slido just, in a few characters, and their ability to frame quite complex thoughts and contributions to our discussion has been really limited that way. All I can do is apologize. It's partly the limitations of the medium, partly the limitations of time, and the curious sort of new forces that emerge out of using new technology this way, that we can have essentially a local meeting that is being witnessed by a very large audience, but that audience are not fully participating, they're partially participating, and that there are frustrations and difficulties that arise out of that. And maybe in future we'll find better answers to these things. So thank you, and I will just now share with everybody Asko Parpola's submission to our symposium. Yes, there we are. That works, I think. So Asko says, in his 2007 book, Greater Magadha, Johannes Bronkhorst proposed a new theory for the historical formation of Indian culture in the first millennium BCE. The theory proposed that a cultural and geographical area, Greater Magadha, was settled by an early wave of Indo-European speakers. A second wave of Indo-European speakers, carriers of Vedic culture, subsequently encountered the Greater Magadhans to the east, and the resultant cultural meeting gave rise to the main features known in later Indian history. Excavations at Sanauli near Delhi in 2018 brought to light royal burials in a large late Harappan graveyard. This was the first time that vehicle burials of the Bronze Age were found in South Asia. Apart from the life-size carts with two solid wheels, apparently pulled by bulls, which were not buried, the dead were accompanied by antenna-hilted swords, shields, a helmet, and ochre-colored pottery, OCP. And they were lying in wooden coffins, otherwise known only from late Harappan context. The finds were radiocarbon dated to around 1900 BCE. It seems clear that immigrants from the Oxus civilization of Central Asia, the BMAC complex, had established themselves as rulers of a major late Harappan community. Several graveyards of the Oxus civilization, dated to 2000 to 1900 BCE, have been found in Pakistani Baluchistan, close to the Bolan Pass, leading to the Indus Valley. But at Sanauli, the newcomers from the Oxus civilization could be connected with the OCP culture, which at several sites occurs together with the late Harappan culture, as well as with the Gangetic copper hoards, which have the antenna-hilted swords as one of the most characteristic artifacts. One such sword comes from the looted graves of northern Afghanistan. This, let me just get forward a page. No, I'm not quite there yet, sorry, trying to do too many things at once. This gives new perspective to the late Bronze Age of South Asia. The late Harappan culture of the OCP culture mainly occupied the Ganga-Yamuna Doab in 1900 to 1300 BCE, while the Gangetic copper hoards moved further east during that period. Around 1300, the late Harappan OCP pottery was replaced by black and red ware pottery from the lower Gangetic Valley, where it originated from the black pottery that had local Neolithic roots. The BRW soon gave rise to the painted grey ware that spread all over the western part of northern South Asia, with reference to Esugi. The Vedic culture of the Brahmana and Sutra period has been connected with the painted grey ware. On the basis of this short sketch, it appears that the Vedic Aryans coming to northern South Asia met an earlier population that consisted of late Harappans speaking a Dravidian language mixed with people coming from the Oxus civilization. The original local language of the Oxus civilization was undoubtedly non-Indo-European. Alexander Lubotsky has studied it by analyzing non-Indo-European loanwords shared by Indo-Aryan and Iranian, but not found in other Indo-European languages. But Oxus immigrants probably belonged to the elite, which seems to have had a pastoral origin and an Indo-European language. While writing a paper on the Sanauli vehicle burials last year, I thought that that language may have been pre-Proto-Indo-Iranian, but now this seems doubtful. Further study is required. Archaeology gives support to the basic proposition of Bronkhorst's Greater Magadha hypothesis, but important related questions remain open. And oops, sorry, I should have scrolled down just to let people see the bibliography a little bit more. So obviously there's a lot to be thought about in that page and a half. But I'm glad to have been able to have the opportunity to share it here with everybody. Well, are there any points, especially Johannes, would you like to say anything now in our final minutes of our meeting? And otherwise we'll, and also we will open up to some questions, which one of our PhD students here, Madhusudan Rimal, I think is standing by to moderate. Hi, Madhu. So Johannes, yes.
No, perhaps I can say something later on towards the conclusion and let the discussion continue on its own at this point.
Very good. Yes, John.
Thanks. But my question still goes to Johannes, even though he would like to wait. But what Asko Parpola just asked or stated was basically the question I wanted to ask you. Because there seems to be quite a bit of opposition here to the idea that karma and rebirth originated in the East. If we just take a worst case scenario and say, okay, they're absolutely right. Worst case scenario from your perspective, perhaps, I'm just guessing here. But we still have quite a bit of evidence for an East-West divide in a lot of different ways with respect to culture from Southeast Asia. I would argue languages from Southeast Asia as well. Dravidian may have played a role as well, but we still have a clear divide. Something happened. How much would that hurt your greater Magadha theory in its present form? I'm not into the details, I have to say. I've skimmed through most of it, but how much of your theory would unravel by saying, okay, I cede here the territory to the other Indologists, but we still have this cultural linguistic divide?
Well, let me say, so far, I have not yet convinced for the need to give up the regional divide. But if I had to, and that's the hypothetical question you ask, then, well, then would, I think one could maintain much of the theory in an adjusted form. Because perhaps more central than many have realized is my reflections about chronology and what influenced what. And second, that there was a cultural divide. And I think that even if one were to follow the previous speaker completely in all he says, Nathan, he too ends up with a cultural divide, even though he has a different historical speculative explanation for it. The cultural divide seems to me more fundamental to the theory than the need to give them different regions. Sure, I still find it a bit difficult to imagine people who interact regularly to have such major, I think the divide is more important than some may wish it to be. And that's why I like to give them their own region. As I said, I can imagine Shramanas, but Shramanas need a mommy and a daddy who tell them that there is a rebirth and karmic retribution and inspire them to take these absolutely drastic steps of giving up all they have and become wandering ascetics. But okay, if arguments are strong enough, things can be adjusted, I think.
Thank you. So, Madhu, this would be a moment where perhaps you could introduce some of the questions from Slido.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and thank you all for your wonderful presentation. It was really intellectually stimulating, and I have learned a lot of new ideas and thoughts from you. Thanks for that, and thank you, Dominic, for organizing this, and thank you very much for our audience. And you have really presented your ideas in terms of suggestions, questions, and remarks. And firstly, I would like to start from Andrew Olet, and he asked to, I guess, to Dr. McGovern, and he writes, I don't see Brahmins behind all or any of the new uses of Sanskrit around OCE, inscription, Buddhist text, Kavya, etc. What do you mean? That's for Dr. McGovern.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Does somebody? What was the last part of it? I don't see Brahmins.
Yes. Behind all of new uses of Sanskrit around 0 CE, inscription.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, but I misunderstood. Sorry. Well, yeah. I was referring to a sort of a debate between Pollock and Johannes himself. Pollock is one to really de-emphasize like this religious connection, which make it not be specifically about Brahmanism. I think that Johannes shows that it is about the spread of. I mean, I agree with him on this, but it's not that only Brahmins were using Sanskrit in this new way. It's just that the new way of, I mean, to frankly just completely defend what Johannes says in his book, Buddhism in the Shadow of Brahmanism, that the origins of the use of Sanskrit in that new way is tied to the spread of Brahmins. And I agree with that. I mean, he can explain that better than I can. He wrote a whole chapter about that, but it's in that book. Yeah.
Thank you.
Johannes, you leant forward. Is that because you're about to say something, or?
No, unless I'm spurred to do so, but no, I'm fine. I think, okay. I do think that Sanskrit, at least for a certain period of time, is intricately linked, almost inseparably, to Brahmanism. But of course that changes at some point, and then even the Buddhists and the Jains, they take it up, but that's a next step. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Madhu, is there another question?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, there is another question for Dr. McGovern, I guess, by Ananya Bajpayee, and she writes, Satyakama identifies with his mother Jabala. He has no gotra. I'm not sure how you square this story with your assertion about the universality of gotra.
So the reason I quoted that story was not to say the universality of Gotra. I was not giving the details of that. There's a very old article by John Brough. I think in the journal, I don't even remember. It was in the Journal of the American Oriental Society or something like that. That makes that argument, I think, fairly convincingly. I don't remember all the details off the top of my head, other than the fact that, for example, the Buddha has a Gotra. But the reason I brought up that particular story from the Chandogya was to say that birth seems to be a question for the admission of this student, but it is phrased in terms of, do you have a Gotra, right? Which would indicate that there is some sort of high birth, but not necessarily the notion of strict Varna in the classical sense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to go to another. I think that is a kind of remark to Dr. Mas from Alexander Skokov. Pardon me, please, if I miscorrect your name. And he writes, Pakuda Katsayana presents something that looks like a caricature of the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, and arguably drawing undesired Sankhya consequences. Shall I move to another?
Philip, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, a caricature of the Bhagavad Gita. I think that's chronologically very difficult to maintain if we consider the Bhagavad Gita as we have it as a quite late text. And references to Sankhya would, of course, not count for me as a reference to Brahmanism, because, as Johannes has argued, and I think quite convincingly, Proto-Sankhya can more be linked to the region of Greater Magadha than to Brahmanism. And we can see also from the reactions of Brahmanism towards classical Sankhya, that Sankhya for a long time was not considered to be a so-called orthodox philosophy, and that even Kumarila says that Sankhya is a Bhākya philosophy. It has nothing to do with the Veda. Yeah, and that's in the in a period that's much later than the one that we are talking about. That would be my reply to this remark. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
Mm-hmm. There is another question for Dr. Archie, and it is from Anonymous. Since Semoy is non-Khmer, would it be useful to look more closely at Khasi, the only MK language in India, as a possible intermediary?
Yes, this would be a question for John, but let me just briefly say that this is not a kind of, if I understood it correctly, some don't actually accept that taxonomy. So they just accept Austroasiatic group, or they divide Khasi from Munda and other Mon-Khmer. Maybe John can, if he's here, can add something.
Yeah, I can only second that. This Mon-Khmer Munda dichotomy has been given up by, I don't work on historical Munda linguistics, but everyone I know who does says basically you either have 10, 11, 12, 13 different subfamilies, depends on who you ask, but you don't have Mon-Khmer Munda anymore. So Mon-Khmer doesn't, Khasi is no longer considered a Mon-Khmer language.
Thank you very much.
Do we have more time, Dominic?
Just maybe for one or two more questions at
Okay,
the most.
so I'll take another question from Walter Negrips, and he asked, Satapatha and Jaiminiya mention King Janaka of Videha. Can they be used as evidence for Brahmanical culture prior to the presupposed encounter with Magadha? It is not directed to any scholar, so anyone could jump in.
I don't think I have a good answer to that, but I think that Brian Black does. So I would say read Brian Black's book on the Upanishads. And Laura, maybe you have more you could say about it, or somebody else, I don't know.
Yeah, Michael Witzel's also written on this question, and I have as well in my dissertation, which you can Google. It's called the Kosalan Philosophy and the Kanva Shatapatha Brahmana and the Sutta Nipata. And I do think that there is some historical information that can be gleaned. I think about the geographical location of the Vedic people at this time, but also the ritual implications implied by that passage. It's a good question.
Thank you both. One more, I guess. Yeah, this is from Konrad Elst, and he asked, no argument for the Upanishads' anteriority to the Buddha. What about Richard Gombrich's pointing out Upanishad passages quoted, whether satirizing or not, by the Buddha? It's not directed to any scholars, so anyone.
I think that might be for me. I sort of addressed this in my dissertation, and Johannes has addressed it too. In my dissertation, which is a little different from my book, I sort of presented what I was doing as a middle path between Bronkhorst and Gombrich. But I share Bronkhorst's skepticism of too easily reading satirical references to the Upanishads, or say, it doesn't mean that I agree in every respect, but he can speak more about it. I see his hand up, so I'll shut up.
Johannes.
Yes, I have dealt with this question, and I have collected and studied in detail every single place where Gombrich claims a direct Upanishadic influence, and I've come to the conclusion that it's not convincing, but for details, one has to go to, I think it is in the Greater Magadha book itself. So one can find this there. Perhaps, since I'm now speaking, can I make a little remark about Janaka and all that? The question was, is that proof or an indication that there was Brahmanism at that time around Janaka and his court? I would say yes, but that does not mean that the stories told about Janaka and Yajnavalkya are records of historical events. I think that is highly unlikely. Stories are placed in past, more or less remote, and I think that is how one has to read such stories as they occur in the wherever, Shatapatha Brahmana, Upanishads.
Dominic, put on your mic.
Sorry, everyone. So incompetent. There are some good questions still, on the discussion, but we really are up against the limit of time now. We've actually gone over the end of our symposium time. So I think I would like to invite all of the speakers to, if there's any last statements or anything that you would like to say, and especially Johannes, if you would like to provide a concluding statement, but you don't have to, just if it seems appropriate to you, if there's something at the front of your mind.
Yes, something that's really in front of my mind is to thank you, Dominique, for organizing this and getting people together and making sure that we have such an interesting conference in spite of the difficulties of electronic communication, which I'm not a fan of, I must say, but I have enjoyed this very much. I'd like to thank you. You came up with the idea, you did all the work, and I've often been thinking, I'm so glad I'm not sitting at your place. You have to be there all the time. Even I had to concentrate more than I'm used to, perhaps, but you did very, very well. And I like to thank you, no doubt, on behalf of everyone, certainly on behalf of me. Thank you very much, Dom.
Thank you very much.
And then, of course, I like to thank all the other participants for having put energy into this and having dealt with some ideas which I brought out 14 years ago. And I'm so happy to see that perhaps it is going to contribute and that new ideas will come forth out of it. So I feel very rewarded for that reason as well. In any case, thank you very much and see you soon again, I hope.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your very gracious remarks, Johannes. And just to wind things up finally, I would like to say that it's a you know, as many of this, I think all of the speakers at different times have said, you have put a huge theory, a huge revisionist theory of ancient India in front of all of us that we have all responded to. We've all found, many of us, if not all of us, found incredibly inspiring. It's not just the details of the theory, but it's also the idea that you can have a theory, the idea that you can completely turn everything upside down and look at things differently. That's incredibly liberating and refreshing. So, you know, whatever else, you know, we may think about details and so forth, the experience of having read your books and articles and having been nudged into thinking freshly and originally about ancient India has been a very great experience. And I have to say, I think for me and for everybody present, it's such a treat to be able to interact with you personally, that we've been able to come together. I know, you know, Zoom is now what we really want to do is go and have a beer together, and we can't do that. But the chance to, as it were, be in the same room with the author of these amazing theories is really a privilege. It really is. I mean, a wonderful opportunity for all of us. So thank you very much for agreeing to participate and to be here with us through these 4 days. Thank you very much, everybody. And I'm sorry to say that's the end of our proceedings. I'm sure we will all continue to be in touch, and I would urge you all to have conferences and do this again. Zoom is not perfect, but it's something, and it's something we can do even in these difficult times. Thank you again, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
It was
I've really
great.
enjoyed everyone's ideas and papers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.